Chippings with a Chisel, from Twice Told Tales by Nathaniel Hawthorne. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Bob Neufeld. Passing a summer several years since at Endicott, on the island of Martha's Vineyard, I became acquainted with a certain carver of tombstones, who had travelled and voyaged thither from the interior of Massachusetts in search of professional employment. The speculation had turned out so successful that my friend expected to transmute slate and marble into silver and gold to the amount of at least $1,000 during the few months of his sojourn at Nantucket and the Vineyard. The secluded life and the simple and primitive spirit which still characterizes the inhabitants of those islands, especially of Martha's Vineyard, ensure their dead friends a longer and dearer remembrance than the daily novelty and revolving bustle of the world can elsewhere afford to beings of the past. Yet, while every family is anxious to erect a memorial to its departed members, the untainted breath of ocean bestows such health and length of days upon the people of the isles as would cause a melancholy dearth of business to a resident artist in that line. His own monument, recording his decease by starvation, would probably be an early specimen of his skill. Gravestones, therefore, have generally been an article of imported merchandise. In my walks through the burial ground of Edgartown, where the dead have lain so long that the soil, once enriched by their decay, has returned to its original barrenness, in that ancient burial ground I noticed much variety of monumental sculpture. The elder stones, dated a century back or more, have borders elaborately carved with flowers, and are adorned with a multiplicity of death's heads, crossbones, scythes, hourglasses, and other lugubrious emblems of mortality, with here and there a winged cherub to direct the mourner's spirit upward. These productions of Gothic taste must have been quite beyond the colonial skill of the day, and were probably carved in London and brought across the ocean to commemorate the defunct worthies of this lonely isle. The more recent monuments are mere slabs of slate in the ordinary style, without any superfluous flourishes to set off the bald inscriptions. But others, and those far the most impressive both to my taste and feelings, were roughly hewn from the grey rocks of the island, evidently by the unskilled hands of surviving friends and relatives. On some there were merely the initials of a name. Some were inscribed with misspelt prose or rhyme, in deep letters which the moss and wintry rain of many years had not been able to obliterate. These were graves where loved ones slept. It is an old theme of satire, the falsehood and vanity of monumental eulogies. But when affection and sorrow grave the letters with their own painful labor, then we may be sure that they copy from the record on their hearts. My acquaintance, the sculptor, he may share that title with Greenough, since the dauber of signs is a painter as well as Raphael, had found a ready market for all his blank slabs of marble, and full occupation in lettering and ornamenting them. He was an elderly man, a descendant of the old Puritan family of Wigglesworth, with a certain simplicity and singleness both of heart and mind, which, methinks, is more rarely found among us Yankees than in any other community of people. In spite of his grey head and wrinkled brow, he was quite like a child in all matters save what had some reference to his own business. He seemed, unless my fancy misled me, to view mankind in no other relation than as people in want of tombstones, and his literary attainments evidently comprehended very little either of prose or poetry which had not at one time or other been inscribed on slate or marble. His sole task and office among the immortal pilgrims of the tomb, the duty for which Providence had sent the old man into the world, as it were with a chisel in his hand, was to label the dead bodies, lest their names should be forgotten at the resurrection. Yet he had not failed within a narrow scope to gather a few sprigs of earthly and more than earthly wisdom, the harvest of many a grave. And lugubrious as his calling might appear, he was as cheerful an old soul as health and integrity and lack of care could make him, and used to set to work upon one sorrowful inscription or another with that sort of spirit which impels a man to sing at his labour. On the whole, I found Mr. Wigglesworth an entertaining and often instructive, if not an interesting character; and partly for the charm of his society, and still more because his work has an invariable attraction for man that is born of woman, I was accustomed to spend some hours a day at his workshop. The quaintness of his remarks, and their not infrequent truth, a truth condensed and pointed by the limited sphere of his view, gave a raciness to his talk which mere worldliness and general cultivation would at once have destroyed. Sometimes we would discuss the respective merits of the various qualities of marble, numerous slabs of which were resting against the walls of the shop, or sometimes an hour or two would pass quietly without a word on either side, while I watched how neatly his chisel struck out letter after letter of the names of the Nortons, the Mayhews, the Luces, the Daggets, and other immemorial families of the vineyard. Often, with an artist's pride, the good old sculptor would speak of favorite productions of his skill which were scattered throughout the village graveyards of New England. But my chief and most instructive amusement was to witness his interviews with his customers, who held interminable consultations about the form and fashion of the desired monuments, the buried excellence to be commemorated, the anguish to be expressed, and finally the lowest price in dollars and cents for which a marble transcript of their feelings might be obtained. Really, my mind received many fresh ideas, which perhaps may remain in it even longer than Mr. Wigglesworth's hardest marble will retain the deepest strokes of his chisel. An elderly lady came to bespeak a monument for her first love, who had been killed by a whale in the Pacific Ocean no less than 40 years before. It was singular that so strong an impression of early feeling should have survived through the changes of her subsequent life, in the course of which she had been a wife and a mother, and, so far as I could judge, a comfortable and happy woman. Reflecting within myself, it appeared to me that this lifelong sorrow, as in all good faith she deemed it, was one of the most fortunate circumstances of her history. It had given an ideality to her mind. It had kept her purer and less earthy than she would otherwise have been by drawing a portion of her sympathies apart from earth. Amid the throng of enjoyments and the pressure of worldly care, and all the warm materialism of this life, she had communed with a vision, and had been better for such intercourse. Faithful to the husband of her maturity, and loving him with a far more real affection than she ever could have felt for the dream of her girlhood, there had still been an imaginative faith to the ocean buried, so that an ordinary character had thus been elevated and refined. Her sighs had been the breath of heaven to her soul. The good lady earnestly desired that the proposed monument should be ornamented with a carved border of marine plants intertwined with twisted seashells, such as were probably waving over her lover's skeleton, or strewn around it in the far depths of the Pacific. But Mr. Wigglesworth's chisel being inadequate to the task, she was forced to content herself with a rose hanging its head from a broken stem. After her departure, I remarked that the symbol was none of the most apt. "And yet," said my friend the sculptor, embodying in this image the thoughts that had been passing through my own mind, "that broken rose has shed its sweet smell through the 40 years of the good woman's life." It was seldom that I could find such pleasant food for contemplation as in the above instance. None of the applicants, I think, affected me more disagreeably than the old man who came, with his fourth wife hanging on his arm, to bespeak gravestones for the 3 former occupants of his marriage-bed. I watched with some anxiety to see whether his remembrance of either were more affectionate than the other 2, but could discover no symptom of the kind. The 3 monuments were all to be of the same material and form, and each decorated in bas-relief with 2 weeping willows, one of these sympathetic trees bending over its fellow, which was to be broken in the midst and rest upon a sepulchral urn. This, indeed, was Mr. Wigglesworth's standing emblem of conjugal bereavement. I shuddered at the grey polygamist who had so utterly lost the holy sense of individuality in wedlock that methought he was fain to reckon upon his fingers how many women who had once slept by his side were now sleeping in their graves. There was even, if I wrong him, it is no great matter, a glance sidelong at his living spouse, as if he were inclined to drive a thriftier bargain by bespeaking 4 gravestones in a lot. I was better pleased with a rough old whaling captain who gave direction for a broad marble slab divided into 2 compartments, one of which was to contain an epitaph on his deceased wife, and the other to be left vacant till death should engrave his own name there. As is frequently the case among the whalers of Martha's Vineyard, so much of this storm-beaten widower's life had been tossed away on distant seas that out of 20 years of matrimony he had spent scarce 3, and those at scattered intervals, beneath his own roof. Thus the wife of his youth, though she died in his and her declining age, retained the bridal dewdrops fresh around her memory. My observations gave me the idea, and Mr. Wigglesworth confirmed it, that husbands were more faithful in setting up memorials to their dead wives than widows to their dead husbands. I was not ill-natured enough to fancy that women less than men feel so sure of their own constancy as to be willing to give a pledge of it in marble. It is more probably the fact that, while men are able to reflect upon their lost companions as remembrances apart from themselves, women, on the other hand, are conscious that a portion of their being has gone with the departed whithersoever he has gone. Soul clings to soul, the living dust has a sympathy with the dust of the grave, and by the very strength of that sympathy the wife of the dead shrinks the more sensitively from reminding the world of its existence. The link is already strong enough, it needs no visible symbol. And though a shadow walks ever by her side, and the touch of a chill hand is on her bosom, yet life, and perchance its natural yearnings, may still be warm within her, and inspire her with new hopes of happiness. Then would she mark out the grave, the scent of which would be perceptible on the pillow of the second bridal. No, but rather level its green mound with the surrounding earth, as if, when she dug up again her buried heart, the spot had ceased to be a grave. Yet, in spite of these sentimentalities, I was prodigiously amused by an incident of which I had not the good fortune to be a witness, but which Mr. Wigglesworth related with considerable humour. A gentlewoman of the town, receiving news of her husband's loss at sea, had bespoken a handsome slab of marble, and come daily to watch the progress of my friend's chisel. One afternoon, when the good lady and the sculptor were in the very midst of the epitaph, which the departed spirit might have been greatly comforted to read, who should walk into the workshop but the deceased himself, in substance as well as spirit? He had been picked up at sea, and stood in no present need of tombstone or epitaph. And how, inquired I, did his wife bear the shock of joyful surprise? "Why," said the old man, deepening the grin of a death's head on which his chisel was just then employed, "I really felt for the poor woman. It was one of my best pieces of marble, and to be thrown away on a living man." A comely woman with a pretty rosebud of a daughter came to select a gravestone for a twin daughter who had died a month before. I was impressed with the different nature of their feelings for the dead. The mother was calm and woefully resigned, fully conscious of her loss, as of a treasure which she had not always possessed, and therefore had been aware that it might be taken from her. But the daughter evidently had no real knowledge of what death's doings were. Her thoughts knew, but not her heart. It seemed to me that by the print and pressure which the dead sister had left upon the survivor's spirit, her feelings were almost the same as if she stood side by side and arm in arm with the departed, looking at the slabs of marble, and once or twice she glanced around with a sunny smile, which, as its sister smile had faded forever, soon grew confusedly overshadowed. Perchance her consciousness was truer than her reflection. Perchance her dead sister was a closer companion than in life. The mother and daughter talked a long while with Mr. Wigglesworth about a suitable epitaph, and finally chose an ordinary verse of ill-matched rhymes which had already been inscribed upon innumerable tombstones. But when we ridicule the triteness of monumental verses, we forget that sorrow reads far deeper in them than we can, and finds a profound and individual purport in what seems so vague and inexpressive unless interpreted by her. She makes the epitaph anew, though the selfsame words may have served for 1,000 graves. And yet, said I afterward to Mr. Wigglesworth, they might have been a better choice than this. While you were discussing the subject, I was struck by at least a dozen simple and natural expressions from the lips of both mother and daughter. One of these would have formed an inscription equally original and appropriate. No, no, replied the sculptor, shaking his head. There is a good deal of comfort to be gathered from these little old scraps of poetry, and so I always recommend them in preference to any new-fangled ones. And somehow they seem to stretch to suit a great grief, and shrink to fit a small one. It was not seldom that ludicrous images were excited by what took place between Mr. Wigglesworth and his customers. A shrewd gentlewoman who kept a tavern in the town was anxious to obtain 2 or 3 gravestones for the deceased members of her family, and to pay for these solemn commodities by taking the sculptor to board. Hereupon a fantasy arose in my mind of good Mr. Wigglesworth sitting down to dinner at a broad, flat tombstone, carving one of his own plump little marble cherubs, gnawing a pair of cross-bones, and drinking out of a hollow death's head, or perhaps a lachrymatory vase or sepulchral urn, while his hostess's dead children waited on him at the ghastly banquet. On communicating this nonsensical picture to the old man, he laughed heartily, and pronounced my humor to be of the right sort. "I have lived at such a table all my days," said he, "and eaten no small quantity of slate and marble." "Hard fare," rejoined I, smiling, "but you seemed to have found it excellent of digestion, too." A man of 50 or thereabouts, with a harsh, unpleasant countenance, ordered a stone for the grave of his bitter enemy, with whom he had waged warfare half a lifetime, to their mutual misery and ruin. The secret of this phenomenon was that hatred had become the sustenance and enjoyment of the poor wretch's soul. It had supplied the place of all kindly affections. It had been really a bond of sympathy between himself and the man who shared the passion, and when its object died, the unappeasable foe was the only mourner for the dead. He expressed a purpose of being buried side by side with his enemy. "I doubt whether their dust will mingle," remarked the old sculptor to me, for often there was an earthliness in his conceptions. "Oh, yes," replied I, who had mused long upon the incident, "and when they rise again, these bitter foes may find themselves dear friends. Methinks what they mistook for hatred was but love under a mask." A gentleman of antiquarian propensities provided a memorial for an Indian of Chabacquiddick, one of the few of untainted blood remaining in that region, and said to be a hereditary chieftain, descended from the sachem who welcomed Governor Mayhew to the vineyard. Mr. Wigglesworth exerted his best skill to carve a broken bow and scattered sheaf of arrows in memory of the hunters and warriors whose race was ended here, but he likewise sculptured a cherub to denote that the poor Indian had shared the Christian's hope of immortality. "Why," observed I, taking a perverse view of the winged boy and the bow and arrows, "it looks more like Cupid's tomb than an Indian chief's." "You talk nonsense," said the sculptor, with the offended pride of art. He then added, with his usual good nature, "How can Cupid die when there are such pretty maidens in the vineyard?" "Very true," answered I, and for the rest of the day I thought of other matters than tombstones. At our next meeting I found him chiseling an open book upon a marble headstone, and concluded that it was meant to express the erudition of some black-letter clergyman of the Cotton Mather school. It turned out, however, to be emblematical of the scriptural knowledge of an old woman who had never read anything but her Bible, and the monument was a tribute to her piety and good works from the Orthodox Church of which she had been a member. In strange contrast with this Christian woman's memorial was that of an infidel whose gravestone, by his own direction, bore an avowal of his belief that the spirit within him would be extinguished like a flame, and that the nothingness whence he sprang would receive him again. Mr. Wigglesworth consulted me as to the propriety of enabling a dead man's dust to utter this dreadful creed. "If I thought," said he, "that a single mortal would read the inscription without a shudder, my chisel would never cut a letter of it. But when the grave speaks such falsehoods, the soul of man will know the truth by its own horror." "So it will," said I, struck by the idea. "The poor infidel may strive to preach blasphemies from his grave, but it will be only another method of impressing the soul with a consciousness of immortality." There was an old man by the name of Norton, noted throughout the island for his great wealth, which he had accumulated by the exercise of strong and shrewd faculties combined with a most penurious disposition. This wretched miser, conscious that he had not a friend to be mindful of him in his grave, had himself taken the needful precautions for posthumous remembrance by bespeaking an immense slab of white marble with a long epitaph in raised letters, the whole to be as magnificent as Mr. Wigglesworth's skill could make it. There was something very characteristic in this contrivance to have his money's worth even from his own tombstone, which, indeed, afforded him more enjoyment in the few months that he lived thereafter than it probably will in a whole century, now that it is laid over his bones. The incident reminds me of a young girl, a pale, slender, feeble creature, most unlike the other rosy and healthful damsels of the vineyard, amid whose brightness she was fading away. Day after day did the poor maiden come to the sculptor's shop and pass from one piece of marble to another, till at last she penciled her name upon a slender slab which, I think, was of a more spotless white than all the rest. I saw her no more, but soon afterward found Mr. Wigglesworth cutting her virgin name into the stone which she had chosen. "She is dead, poor girl," said he, interrupting the tune which he was whistling, "and she chose a good piece of stuff for her headstone. Now, which of these slabs would you like best to see your own name on?" "Why, to tell you the truth, my good Mr. Wigglesworth," replied I, after a moment's pause, for the abruptness of the question had somewhat startled me, "to be quite sincere with you, I care little or nothing about a stone for my own grave, and am somewhat inclined to skepticism as to the propriety of erecting monuments at all over the dust that once was human. The weight of these heavy marbles, though unfelt by the dead corpse or the enfranchised soul, presses drearily upon the spirit of the survivor and causes him to connect the idea of death with the dungeon-like imprisonment of the tomb, instead of with the freedom of the skies. Every gravestone that you ever made is the visible symbol of a mistaken system. Our thoughts should soar upward with the butterfly, not linger with the exuviae that confined them. In truth and reason, neither those whom we call the living, and still less the departed, have anything to do with the grave." "I never heard anything so heathenish," said Mr. Wigglesworth, perplexed and displeased at sentiments which controverted all his notions and feelings, and implied the utter waste, and worse, of his whole life's labor. "Would you forget your dead friends the moment they are under the sod?" "They are not under the sod," I rejoined. "Then why should I mark the spot where there is no treasure hidden? Forget them? No, but to remember them aright, I would forget what they have cast off, and to gain the truer conception of death, I would forget the grave." But still the good old sculptor murmured and stumbled, as it were, over the gravestones amid which he had walked through life. Whether he were right or wrong, I had grown the wiser from our companionship and from my observations of nature and character as displayed by those who came, with their old griefs or their new ones, to get them recorded upon his slabs of marble. And yet with my gain of wisdom I had likewise gained perplexity, for there was a strange doubt in my mind whether the dark shadowing of this life, the sorrows and regrets, have not as much real comfort in them, leaving religious influences out of the question, as what we term life's joys. End of Chippings with a Chisel. The Shaker Bridal, from Twice Told Tales by Nathaniel Hawthorne. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Bob Neufeld. One day, in the sick chamber of Father Ephraim, who had been 40 years the presiding elder over the Shaker settlement at Goshen, there was an assemblage of several of the chief men of the sect. Individuals had come from the rich establishment at Lebanon, from Canterbury, Harvard, and Alfred, and from all the other localities where this strange people have fertilized the rugged hills of New England by their systematic industry. An elder was likewise there who had made a pilgrimage of 1,000 miles from a village of the faithful in Kentucky to visit his spiritual kindred, the children of the sainted Mother Ann. He had partaken of the homely abundance of their tables, had quaffed the far-famed Shaker cider, and had joined in the sacred dance, every step of which is believed to alienate the enthusiast from earth and bear him onward to heavenly purity and bliss. His brethren of the North had now courteously invited him to be present on an occasion when the concurrence of every eminent member of their community was peculiarly desirable. The venerable Father Ephraim sat in his easy-chair, not only hoary-headed and infirm with age, but worn down by a lingering disease, which it was evident would very soon transfer his patriarchal staff to other hands. At his footstool stood a man and woman, both clad in the Shaker garb. "My brethren," said Father Ephraim to the surrounding elders, feebly exerting himself to utter these few words, "here are the son and daughter to whom I would commit the trust of which Providence is about to lighten my weary shoulders. Read their faces, I pray you, and say whether the inward movement of the Spirit hath guided my choice aright." Accordingly, each elder looked at the two candidates with a most scrutinizing gaze. The man, whose name was Adam Colburn, had a face sunburnt with labor in the fields, yet intelligent, thoughtful, and traced with cares enough for a whole lifetime, though he had barely reached middle age. There was something severe in his aspect and a rigidity throughout his person, characteristics that caused him generally to be taken for a schoolmaster, which vocation, in fact, he had formerly exercised for several years. The woman, Martha Pearson, was somewhat over 30, as a Shaker sister almost invariably is, and not entirely free from that corpse-like appearance which the garb of the sisterhood is so well calculated to impart. "This pair are still in the summer of their years," observed the elder from Harvard, a shrewd old man. "I would like better to see the hoar frost of autumn on their heads. Methinks, also, they will be exposed to peculiar temptations on account of the carnal desires which have heretofore subsisted between them." "Nay, brother," said the elder from Canterbury, "the hoar frost and the black frost hath done its work on brother Adam and sister Martha, even as we sometimes discern its traces in our cornfields while they are not yet green. And why should we question the wisdom of our venerable father's purpose? Although this pair in their early youth have loved one another as the world's people love. Are there not many brothers and sisters among us who have lived long together in wedlock, yet, adopting our faith, find their hearts purified from all but spiritual affection? Whether or no the early loves of Adam and Martha had rendered it inexpedient that they should now preside together over a Shaker village, it was certainly most singular that such should be the final result of many warm and tender hopes. Children of neighboring families, their affection was older even than their school days. It seemed an innate principle interfused among all their sentiments and feelings, and not so much a distinct remembrance as connected with their whole volume of remembrances. But just as they reached a proper age for their union, misfortunes had fallen heavily on both, and made it necessary that they should resort to personal labor for a bare subsistence. Even under these circumstances, Martha Pierson would probably have consented to unite her fate with Adam Colburn's, and, secure of the bliss of mutual love, would patiently have awaited the less important gifts of fortune. But Adam, being of a calm and cautious character, was loath to relinquish the advantages which a single man possesses for raising himself in the world. Year after year, therefore, their marriage had been deferred. Adam Colburn had followed many vocations, had travelled far and seen much of the world and of life. Martha had earned her bread sometimes as a seamstress, sometimes as help to a farmer's wife, sometimes as schoolmistress of the village children, sometimes as a nurse or watcher of the sick, thus acquiring a varied experience, the ultimate use of which she little anticipated. But nothing had gone prosperously with either of the lovers. At no subsequent moment would matrimony have been so prudent a measure as when they had first parted, in the opening bloom of life, to seek a better fortune. Still they held fast their mutual faith. Martha might have been the wife of a man who sat among the senators of his native state, and Adam could have won the hand, as he had unintentionally won the heart, of a rich and comely widow. But neither of them desired good fortune save to share it with the other. At length that calm despair which occurs only in a strong and somewhat stubborn character, and yields to no second spring of hope, settled down on the spirit of Adam Colburn. He sought an interview with Martha, and proposed that they should join the society of Shakers. The converts of this sect are oftener driven within its hospitable gates by worldly misfortune than drawn thither by fanaticism, and are received without inquisition as to their motives. Martha, faithful still, had placed her hand in that of her lover, and accompanied him to the Shaker village. Here the natural capacity of each, cultivated and strengthened by the difficulties of their previous lives, had soon gained them an important rank in the society, whose members are generally below the ordinary standard of intelligence. Their faith and feelings had in some degree become assimilated to those of their fellow worshippers. Adam Colburn gradually acquired reputation not only in the management of the temporal affairs of the society, but as a clear and efficient preacher of their doctrines. Martha was not less distinguished in the duties proper to her sex. Finally, when the infirmities of Father Ephraim had admonished them to seek a successor in his patriarchal office, he thought of Adam and Martha, and proposed to renew in their persons the primitive form of Shaker government as established by Mother Ann. They were to be the father and mother of the village. The simple ceremony which would constitute them such was now to be performed. "Son Adam and daughter Martha," said the venerable Father Ephraim, fixing his aged eyes piercingly upon them, "if ye can conscientiously undertake this charge, speak, that the brethren may not doubt of your fitness." "Father," replied Adam, speaking with the calmness of his character, "I came to your village a disappointed man, weary of the world, worn out with continual trouble, seeking only a security against evil fortune, as I had no hope of good. Even my wishes of worldly success were almost dead within me. I came hither as a man might come to a tomb, willing to lie down in its gloom and coldness for the sake of its peace and quiet. There was but one earthly affection in my breast, and it had grown calmer since my youth, so that I was satisfied to bring Martha to be my sister in our new abode. We are brother and sister, nor would I have it otherwise, and in this peaceful village I have found all that I hope for, all that I desire.
I will strive with my best strength for the spiritual and temporal good of our community. My conscience is not doubtful in this matter. I am ready to receive the trust." "Thou hast spoken well, son Adam," said the father. "God will bless thee in the office which I am about to resign." "But our sister," observed the elder from Harvard, "hath she not likewise a gift to declare her sentiments?" Martha started and moved her lips, as if she would have made a formal reply to this appeal. But had she attempted it, perhaps the old recollections, the long-repressed feelings of childhood, youth, and womanhood, might have gushed from her heart in words that it would have been profanation to utter there. "Adam has spoken," said she hurriedly. "His sentiments are likewise mine." But while speaking these few words, Martha grew so pale that she looked fitter to be laid in her coffin than to stand in the presence of Father Ephraim and the elders. She shuddered also, as if there were something awful or horrible in her situation and destiny. It required, indeed, a more than feminine strength of nerve to sustain the fixed observance of men so exalted and famous throughout the beat as these were. They had overcome their natural sympathy with human frailties and affections. One, when he joined the society, had brought with him his wife and children, but never from that hour had spoken a fond word to the former or taken his best-loved child upon his knee. Another, whose family refused to follow him, had been enabled, such was his gift of holy fortitude, to leave them to the mercy of the world. The youngest of the elders, a man of about 50, had been bred from infancy in a Shaker village, and was said never to have clasped a woman's hand in his own, and to have no conception of a closer tie than the cold fraternal one of the sect. Old Father Ephraim was the most awful character of all. In his youth he had been a dissolute libertine, but was converted by Mother Ann herself, and had partaken of the wild fanaticism of the early Shakers. Tradition whispered at the firesides of the village that Mother Ann had been compelled to sear his heart of flesh with a red-hot iron before it could be purified from earthly passions. However that might be, poor Martha had a woman's heart, and a tender one, and it quailed within her as she looked round at those strange old men, and from them to the calm features of Adam Colburn. But, perceiving that the elders eyed her doubtfully, she gasped for breath and again spoke. "With what strength is left me by my many troubles," said she, "I am ready to undertake this charge, and to do my best in it." "My children, join your hands," said Father Ephraim. They did so. The elders stood up around, and the father feebly raised himself to a more erect position, but continued sitting in his great chair. "I have bidden you to join your hands," said he, "not in earthly affection, for ye have cast off its chains forever, but as brother and sister in spiritual love, and helpers of one another in your allotted task. Teach unto others the faith which ye have received. Open wide your gates. I deliver you the keys thereof. Open them wide to all who will give up the iniquities of the world and come hither to lead lives of purity and peace. Receive the weary ones who have known the vanity of earth. Receive the little children, that they may never learn that miserable lesson. And a blessing be upon your labors, so that the time may hasten on when the mission of Mother Ann shall have wrought its full effect, when children shall no more be born and die, and the last survivor of mortal race, some old and weary man like me, shall see the sun go down, never more to rise on a world of sin and sorrow." The aged father sank back exhausted, and the surrounding elders deemed, with good reason, that the hour was come when the new heads of the village must enter on their patriarchal duties. In their attention to Father Ephraim, Their eyes were turned from Martha Pearson, who grew paler and paler, unnoticed even by Adam Colburn. He indeed had withdrawn his hand from hers, and folded his arms with a sense of satisfied ambition. But paler and paler grew Martha by his side, till, like a corpse in its burial clothes, she sank down at the feet of her early lover. For, after many trials firmly borne, her heart could endure the weight of its desolate agony no longer. End of the Shaker Bridal. Night Sketches Beneath an Umbrella, from Twice Told Tales by Nathaniel Hawthorne. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Bob Neufeld. Pleasant is a rainy winter's day within doors. The best study for such a day, or the best amusement, call it what you will, is a book of travels describing scenes the most unlike that sombre one which is mistily presented through the windows. I have experienced that fancy is then most successful in imparting distinct shapes and vivid colors to the objects which the author has spread upon his page, and that his words become magic spells to summon up 1,000 varied pictures. Strange landscapes glimmer through the familiar walls of the room, and outlandish figures thrust themselves almost within the sacred precincts of the hearth. Small as my chamber is, it has space enough to contain the ocean-like circumference of an Arabian desert, its parched sands tracked by the long line of a caravan with the camels patiently journeying through the heavy sunshine. Though my ceiling be not lofty, yet I can pile up the mountains of Central Asia beneath it till their summits shine far above the clouds of the middle atmosphere. And with my humble means, a wealth that is not taxable, I can transport hither the magnificent merchandise of an Oriental bazaar, and call a crowd of purchasers from distant countries to pay a fair profit for the precious articles which are displayed on all sides. True it is, however, that amid the bustle of traffic, or whatever else may seem to be going on around me, the raindrops will occasionally be heard to patter against my window-panes, which look forth upon one of the quietest streets in a New England town. After a time, too, the visions vanish, and will not appear again at my bidding. Then, it being nightfall, a gloomy sense of unreality depresses my spirits, and impels me to venture out before the clock shall strike bedtime, to satisfy myself that the world is not entirely made up of such shadowy materials as have busied me throughout the day. A dreamer may dwell so long among fantasies that the things without him will seem as unreal as those within. When eve has fairly set in, therefore, I sally forth, tightly buttoning my shaggy overcoat and hoisting my umbrella, the silken dome of which immediately resounds with the heavy drumming of the invisible raindrops. Pausing on the lowest doorstep, I contrast the warmth and cheerfulness of my deserted fireside with the drear obscurity and chill discomfort into which I am about to plunge. Now come fearful auguries innumerable as the drops of rain. Did not my manhood cry shame upon me, I should turn back within doors, resume my elbow-chair, my slippers and my book, pass such an evening of sluggish enjoyment as the day has been, and go to bed inglorious. The same shivering reluctance, no doubt, has quelled for a moment the adventurous spirit of many a traveller, when his feet, which were destined to measure the earth around, were leaving their last tracks in the home paths. In my own case, poor human nature may be allowed a few misgivings. I look upward and discern no sky, not even an unfathomable void, but only a black, impenetrable nothingness, as though heaven and all its lights were blotted from the system of the universe. It is as if nature were dead, and the world had put on black, and the clouds were weeping for her. With their tears upon my cheek, I turn my eyes earthward, but find little consolation here below. A lamp is burning dimly at the distant corner, and throws just enough light along the street to show, and exaggerate by so faintly showing, the perils and difficulties which beset my path. Yonder dingily white remnant of a huge snowbank, which will yet cumber the sidewalk till the latter days of March, over or through that wintry waste must I stride onward. Beyond lies a certain slough of despond, a concoction of mud and liquid filth, ankle deep, leg deep, neck deep, in a word, of unknown bottom, on which the lamplight does not even glimmer, but which I have occasionally watched in the gradual growth of its horrors from morn till nightfall. Should I flounder into its depths, farewell to upper earth. And hark! How roughly resounds the roaring of a stream, the turbulent career of which is partially reddened by the gleam of the lamp, but elsewhere brawls noisily through the densest gloom. Oh, should I be swept away in fording that impetuous and unclean torrent, the coroner will have a job with an unfortunate gentleman who would fain end his troubles anywhere but in a mud-puddle. Ah, I will linger not another instant at arm's length from these dim terrors, which grow more obscurely formidable the longer I delay to grapple with them. Now for the onset, and lo, with little damage save a dash of rain in the face and breast, a splash of mud high up on the pantaloons, and the left boot full of ice-cold water, behold me at the corner of the street. The lamp throws down a circle of red light around me, and twinkling onward from corner to corner, I discern other beacons marshalling my way to a brighter scene. But this is a lonesome and dreary spot. The tall edifices bid gloomy defiance to the storm with their blinds all closed, even as a man winks when he faces a spattering gust. How loudly tinkles the collected rain down the tin spouts! The puffs of wind are boisterous, and seem to assail me from various quarters at once. I have often observed that this corner is a haunt and loitering place for those winds which have no work to do upon the deep, dashing ships against our iron-bound shores, nor in the forest tearing up the sylvan giants with half a rood of soil at their vast roots. Here they amuse themselves with lesser freaks of mischief. See, at this moment, how they assail yonder poor woman who is passing just within the verge of the lamplight. One blast struggles for her umbrella, and it turns wrong side outward. Another whisks the cape of her cloak across her eyes, while the third takes almost unwarrantable liberties with the lower part of her attire. Happily, the good dame is no gossamer, but a figure of rotundity and fleshly substance. Else would these aerial tormentors whirl her aloft like a witch upon a broomstick, and set her down, doubtless, in the filthiest kennel hereabout. From hence I tread upon firm pavements into the centre of the town. Here there is almost as brilliant an illumination as when some great victory has been won either on the battlefield or at the polls. 2 rows of shops with windows down nearly to the ground cast a glow from side to side, while the black night hangs overhead like a canopy, and thus keeps the splendor from diffusing itself away. The wet sidewalks gleam with a broad sheet of red light. The raindrops glitter as if the sky were pouring down rubies. The spouts gush with fire. Methinks the scene is an emblem of the deceptive glare which mortals throw around their footsteps in the moral world, thus bedazzling themselves till they forget the impenetrable obscurity that hems them in, and that can be dispelled only by radiance from above. And, after all, it is a cheerless scene, and cheerless are the wanderers in it. Here comes one who has so long been familiar with tempestuous weather that he takes the bluster of the storm for a friendly greeting, as if it should say, "How fare ye, brother?" He is a retired sea-captain, wrapped in some nameless garment of the pea-jacket order, and is now laying his course toward the Marine Insurance Office, there to spin yarns of gale and shipwreck with a crew of old sea-dogs like himself. The blast will put in its word among those hoarse voices, and be understood by all of them. Next I meet an unhappy, slipshod gentleman, with a cloak flung hastily over his shoulders, running a race with boisterous winds, and striving to glide between the drops of rain. Some domestic emergency or other has blown this miserable man from his warm fireside in quest of a doctor. See that little vagabond! How carelessly he has taken his stand right underneath a spout, while staring at some object of curiosity in a shop window. Surely the rain is his native element. He must have fallen with it from the clouds, as frogs are supposed to do. Here is a picture, and a pretty one. A young man and a girl, both enveloped in cloaks and huddled beneath the scanty protection of a cotton umbrella. She wears rubber overshoes, but he is in his dancing pumps, and they are on their way, no doubt, to some cotillion party or subscription ball at $1 a head, refreshments included. Thus they struggle against the gloomy tempest, lured on by a vision of festal splendor. But, a most lamentable disaster! Bewildered by the red, blue, and yellow meteors in an apothecary's window, they have stepped upon a slippery remnant of ice, and are precipitated into a confluence of swollen floods at the corner of 2 streets. Luckless lovers! Were it my nature to be other than a looker-on in life, I would attempt your rescue. Since that may not be, I vow, should you be drowned, to weave such a pathetic story of your fate as shall call forth tears enough to drown you both anew. Do ye touch bottom, my young friends? Yes, they emerge, like a water-nymph and a river deity, and paddle hand in hand out of the depths of the dark pool. They hurry homeward, dripping, disconsolate, abashed, but with love too warm to be chilled by the cold water. They have stood a test which proves too strong for many. Faithful, though over head and ears in trouble. Onward I go, deriving a sympathetic joy or sorrow from the varied aspect of mortal affairs, even as my figure catches a gleam from the lighted windows, or is blackened by an interval of darkness. Not that mine is altogether a chameleon spirit with no hue of its own. Now I pass into a more retired street, where the dwellings of wealth and poverty are intermingled, presenting a range of strongly contrasted pictures. Here, too, may be found the golden mean. Through yonder casement I discern a family circle, the grandmother, the parents, and the children, all flickering, shadow-like, in the glow of a wood fire. Bluster, fierce blast, and beat, thou wintry rain, against the window-panes. Ye cannot damp the enjoyment of that fireside. Surely my fate is hard, that I should be wandering homeless here, taking to my bosom night and storm and solitude instead of wife and children. Peace, murmurer! Doubt not that darker guests are sitting round the hearth, though the warm blaze hides all but blissful images. Well, here is still a brighter scene, a stately mansion illuminated for a ball, with cut-glass chandeliers and alabaster lamps in every room, and sunny landscapes hanging round the walls. See, a coach has stopped, whence emerges a slender beauty, who, canopied by 2 umbrellas, glides within the portal and vanishes amid lightsome thrills of music. Will she ever feel the night wind and the rain? Perhaps. And will death and sorrow ever enter that proud mansion? As surely as the dancers will be gay within its halls tonight. Such thoughts sadden yet satisfy my heart, for they teach me that the poor man in this mean, weather-beaten hovel, without a fire to cheer him, may call the rich his brother. Brethren by sorrow, who must be an inmate of both their households, brethren by death, who will lead them both to other homes. Onward, still onward, I plunge into the night. Now have I reached the utmost limits of the town, where the last lamp struggles feebly with the darkness like the farthest star that stands sentinel on the borders of uncreated space. It is strange what sensations of sublimity may spring from a very humble source. Such are suggested by this hollow roar of a subterranean cataract, where the mighty stream of a kennel precipitates itself beneath an iron grate and is seen no more on earth. Listen awhile to its voice of mystery, and fancy will magnify it till you start and smile at the illusion. And now another sound, the rumbling of wheels as the mail-coach, outward bound, rolls heavily off the pavements and splashes through the mud and water of the road. All night long the poor passengers will be tossed to and fro between drowsy watch and troubled sleep, and will dream of their own quiet beds, and awake to find themselves still jolting onward. Happier my lot, who will straightway hie me to my familiar room, and toast myself comfortably before the fire, musing and fitfully dozing, and fancying a strangeness in such sights as all may see. But first let me gaze at this solitary figure who comes hitherward with a tin lantern, which throws a circular pattern of its punched holes on the ground about him. He passes fearlessly into the unknown gloom, whither I will not follow him. This figure shall supply me with a moral wherewith, for lack of a more appropriate one, I may wind up my sketch. He fears not to tread the dreary path before him, because his lantern, which was kindled at the fireside of his home, will light him back to that same fireside again. And thus we, night wanderers through a stormy and dismal world, if we bear the lamp of faith enkindled at a celestial fire, it will surely lead us home to that heaven whence its radiance was borrowed. End of Night Sketches beneath an umbrella. Endicott and the Red Cross, from Twice Told Tales by Nathaniel Hawthorne. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Bob Neufeld. At noon of an autumnal day more than 2 centuries ago, the English colours were displayed by the standard-bearer of the Salem train band, which had mustered for martial exercise under the orders of John Endicott. It was a period when the religious exiles were accustomed often to buckle on their armour and practise the handling of their weapons of war. Since the first settlement of New England, its prospects had never been so dismal. The dissensions between Charles I and his subjects were then, and for several years afterward, confined to the floor of Parliament. The measures of the king and ministry were rendered more tyrannically violent by an opposition which had not yet acquired sufficient confidence in its own strength to resist royal injustice with the sword. The bigoted and haughty primate Laud, Archbishop of Canterbury, controlled the religious affairs of the realm, and was consequently invested with powers which might have wrought the utter ruin of the 2 Puritan colonies, Plymouth and Massachusetts. There is evidence on record that our forefathers perceived their danger, but were resolved that their infant country should not fall without a struggle, even beneath the giant strength of the king's right arm. Such was the aspect of the times when the folds of the English banner with the red cross in its field were flung out over a company of Puritans. Their leader, the famous Endicott, was a man of stern and resolute countenance, the effect of which was heightened by a grizzled beard that swept the upper portion of his breastplate. This piece of armor was so highly polished that the whole surrounding scene had its image in the glittering steel. The central object in the mirrored picture was an edifice of humble architecture with neither steeple nor bell to proclaim it. What, nevertheless, it was, the house of prayer. A token of the perils of the wilderness was seen in the grim head of a wolf which had just been slain within the precincts of the town, and according to the regular mode of claiming the bounty, was nailed on the porch of the meeting-house. The blood was still plashing on the doorstep. There happened to be visible at the same noontide hour so many other characteristics of the times and manners of the Puritans that we must endeavor to represent them in a sketch, though far less vividly than they were reflected in the polished breastplate of John Endicott. In close vicinity to the sacred edifice appeared that important engine of Puritanic authority, the whipping-post, with the soil around it well trodden by the feet of evil-doers who had there been disciplined. At one corner of the meeting-house was the pillory, and at the other the stocks, and by a singular good fortune for our sketch, the head of an Episcopalian and suspected Catholic was grotesquely encased in the former machine, while a fellow criminal who had boisterously quaffed a health to the king was confined by the legs in the latter. Side by side on the meeting-house steps stood a male and female figure. The man was a tall, lean, haggard personification of fanaticism, bearing on his breast this label, "A wanton gospeller," which betokened that he had dared to give interpretations of Holy Writ unsanctioned by the infallible judgment of the civil and religious rulers. His aspect showed no lack of zeal to maintain his heterodoxies even at the stake. The woman wore a cleft stick on her tongue, in appropriate retribution for having wagged that unruly member against the elders of the church, and her countenance and gestures gave much cause to apprehend that the moment the stick should be removed, a repetition of the offence would demand new ingenuity in chastising it. The above-mentioned individuals had been sentenced to undergo their various modes of ignominy for the space of 1 hour at noonday. But among the crowd were several whose punishment would be lifelong, some whose ears had been cropped like those of a puppy-dog's, others whose cheeks had been branded with the initials of their misdemeanors, one with his nostrils slit and seared, and another with a halter about his neck, which he was forbidden ever to take off or to conceal beneath his garments. Methinks he must have been grievously tempted to affix the other end of the rope to some convenient beam or bough. There was likewise a young woman with no mean share of beauty, whose doom it was to wear the letter A on the breast of her gown in the eyes of all the world and her own children, and even her own children knew what that initial signified. Sporting her with infamy, the lost and desperate creature had embroidered the fatal token in scarlet cloth with golden thread, and the nicest art of needlework, so that the capital A might have been thought to mean admirable, or anything rather than adulterous. Let not the reader argue from any of these evidences of iniquity that the times of the Puritans were more vicious than our own, when, as we pass along the very street of this sketch, we discern no badge of infamy on man or woman. It was the policy of our ancestors to search out even the most secret sins and expose them to shame without fear or favor in the broadest light of the noonday sun. Were such the custom now, perchance we might find materials for a no less piquant sketch than the above. Except the malefactors whom we have described, and the diseased or infirm persons, the whole male population of the town, between 16 years and 60, were seen in the ranks of the train band. A few stately savages, in all the pomp and dignity of the primeval Indian, stood gazing at the spectacle. Their flint-headed arrows were but childish weapons compared with the matchlocks of the Puritans, and would have rattled harmlessly against the steel caps and hammered iron breastplates which enclosed each soldier in an individual fortress. The valiant John Endicott glanced with an eye of pride at his sturdy followers, and prepared to renew the martial toils of the day. "Come, my stout hearts," quoth he, drawing his sword. "Let us show these poor heathen that we can handle our weapons like men of might. Well for them if they put us not to prove it in earnest."
The iron-breasted company straightened their line, and each man drew the heavy butt of his matchlock close to his left foot, thus awaiting the orders of the captain. But as Endicott glanced right and left along the front, he discovered a personage at some little distance with whom it behoved him to hold a parley. It was an elderly gentleman, wearing a black cloak and band and a high-crowned hat, beneath which was a velvet skull-cap, the whole being the garb of a Puritan minister. This reverend person bore a staff which seemed to have been recently cut in the forest, and his shoes were bemired, as if he had been travelling on foot through the swamps of the wilderness. His aspect was perfectly that of a pilgrim, heightened also by an apostolic dignity. Just as Endicott perceived him, he laid aside his staff and stooped to drink at a bubbling fountain which gushed into the sunshine about a score of yards from the corner of the meeting-house. But ere the good man drank, he turned his face heavenward in thankfulness, and then, holding back his grey beard with one hand, he scooped up his simple draught in the hollow of the other. "What ho, good Mr. Williams!" shouted Endicott. "You are welcome back again to our town of peace. How does our worthy Governor Winthrop, and what news from Boston?" "The governor hath his health, worshipful sir," answered Roger Williams, now resuming his staff and drawing near. "And for the news, here is a letter, which, knowing I was to travel hitherward to-day, his Excellency committed to my charge. Belike it contains tidings of much import, for a ship arrived yesterday from England." Mr. Williams, the minister of Salem, and of course known to all the spectators, had now reached the spot where Endicott was standing under the banner of his company, and put the governor's epistle into his hand. The broad seal was impressed with Winthrop's coat of arms. Endicott hastily unclosed the letter and began to read, while as his eye passed down the page, a wrathful change came over his manly countenance. The blood glowed through it till it seemed to be kindling with an internal heat, nor was it unnatural to suppose that his breastplate would likewise become red-hot with the angry fire of the bosom which it covered. Arriving at the conclusion, he shook the letter fiercely in his hand, so that it rustled as loud as the flag above his head. "Black tidings these, Mr. Williams," said he. "Blacker never came to New England. Doubtless you know their purport." "Yea, truly," replied Roger Williams, "for the governor consulted respecting this matter with my brethren in the ministry at Boston, and my opinion was likewise asked. And his Excellency entreats you by me that news be not suddenly noised abroad, lest the people be stirred up into some outbreak, and thereby give the king and the archbishop a handle against us." "The governor is a wise man, and a meek and moderate," said Endicott, setting his teeth grimly. "Nevertheless, I must do according to my own best judgment. There is neither man, woman, nor child in New England but has a concern as dear as life in these tidings. And if John Endicott's voice be loud enough, man, woman, and child shall hear them. Soldiers, wheel into a hollow square. Oh, good people, here are news for one and all of you." The soldiers closed in around their captain, and he and Roger Williams stood together under the banner of the Red Cross, while the women and the aged men pressed forward and the mothers held up their children to look Endicott in the face. A few taps of the drum gave signal for silence and attention. "Fellow soldiers, fellow exiles," began Endicott, speaking under strong excitement, yet powerfully restraining it. "Wherefore did you leave your native country? Wherefore, I say, have we left the green and fertile fields, the cottages, or perchance the old grey halls, where we were born and bred, the churchyards where our forefathers lie buried? Wherefore have we come hither to set up our own tombstones in a wilderness? A howling wilderness it is.
The wolf and the bear meet us within halloo of our dwellings. The savage lieth in wait for us in the dismal shadow of the woods. The stubborn roots of the trees break our plowshares when we would till the earth. Our children cry for bread, and we must dig in the sands of the seashore to satisfy them. Wherefore, I say again, have we sought this country of a rugged soil and wintry sky? Was it not for the enjoyment of our civil rights? Was it not for liberty to worship God according to our conscience? Call you this liberty of conscience? Interrupted a voice on the steps of the meeting-house. It was the wanton gospeller. A sad and quiet smile flitted across the mild visage of Roger Williams, but Endicott, in the excitement of the moment, shook his sword wrathfully at the culprit, an ominous gesture from a man like him. "What hast thou to do with conscience, thou knave?" cried he. "I said liberty to worship God, not license to profane and ridicule him. Break not in upon my speech, or I will lay thee neck and heels till this time tomorrow. Hearken to me, friends, nor heed that accursed rhapsodist. As I was saying, we have sacrificed all things, and have come to a land whereof the old world hath scarcely heard, that we might make a new world unto ourselves, and painfully seek a path from hence to heaven. But what think ye now? This son of a Scottish tyrant, this grandson of a papistical and adulterous Scotch woman, whose death proved that a golden crown doth not always save an anointed head from the block. Nay, brother, nay, interposed Mr. Williams. Thy words are not meet for a secret chamber, far less for a public street. Hold thy peace, Roger Williams, answered Endicott imperiously. My spirit is wiser than thine for the business now in hand. I tell ye, fellow exiles, that Charles of England and Laud, our bitterest persecutor, archpriest of Canterbury, are resolute to pursue us even hither. They are taking counsel, saith this letter, to send over a governor-general in whose breast shall be deposited all the law and equity of the land. They are minded also to establish the idolatrous forms of English episcopacy, so that when Laud shall kiss the Pope's toe as Cardinal of Rome, he may deliver New England, bound hand and foot, into the power of his master. A deep groan from the auditors, a sound of wrath as well as fear and sorrow, responded to this intelligence. Look ye to it, brethren, resumed Endicott with increasing energy. If this king and this archprelate have their will, we shall briefly behold a cross on the spire of this tabernacle which we have builded, and a high altar within its walls, with wax tapers burning round it at noonday. We shall hear the sacring bell and the voices of the Romish priests saying the mass. But think ye, Christian men, that these abominations may be suffered without a sword drawn, without a shot fired, without blood spilt, yea, on the very stairs of the pulpit? No. Be ye strong of hand and stout of heart. Here we stand on our own soil, which we have bought with our goods, which we have won with our swords, which we have cleared with our axes, which we have tilled with the sweat of our brows, which we have sanctified with our prayers to the God that brought us hither. Who shall enslave us here? What have we to do with this mitred prelate, with this crowned king? What have we to do with England? Endicott gazed round at the excited countenances of the people, now full of his own spirit, and then turned suddenly to the standard-bearer, who stood close behind him. Officer, lower your banner, said he. The officer obeyed, and, brandishing his sword, Endicott thrust it through the cloth, and with his left hand rent the red cross completely out of the banner. He then waved the tattered ensign above his head. "Sacrilegious wretch!" cried the high churchman in the pillory, unable longer to restrain himself. "Thou hast rejected the symbol of our holy religion." "Treason! Treason!" roared the royalist in the stocks. "He hath defaced the king's banner." "Before God and man I will avouch the deed," answered Endicott. "Beat a flourish, drummer! Shout, soldiers and people, in honor of the ensign of New England. Neither pope nor tyrant hath part in it now." With a cry of triumph the people gave their sanction to one of the boldest exploits which our history records, and forever honored by the name of Endicott. We look back through the mist of ages and recognize in the rending of the red cross from New England's banner the first omen of that deliverance which our fathers consummated after the bones of the stern Puritan had lain more than a century in the dust. End of Endicott and the Red Cross. The Lily's Quest, an Apologue. From Twice Told Tales by Nathaniel Hawthorne. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Bob Neufeld. Two lovers once upon a time had planned a little summer house in the form of an antique temple, which it was their purpose to consecrate to all manner of refined and innocent enjoyments. There they would hold pleasant intercourse with one another and the circle of their familiar friends. There they would give festivals of delicious fruit. There they would hear lightsome music intermingled with the strains of pathos which make joy more sweet. There they would read poetry and fiction, and permit their own minds to flit away in daydreams and romance. There, in short, for why should we shape out the vague sunshine of their hopes? There all pure delights were to cluster like roses among the pillars of the edifice, and blossom ever new and spontaneously. So, one breezy and cloudless afternoon, Adam Forrester and Lilias Fay set out upon a ramble over the wide estate which they were to possess together, seeking a proper site for their temple of happiness. They were themselves a fair and happy spectacle, fit priest and priestess for such a shrine, although, making poetry of the pretty name of Lilias, Adam Forrester was wont to call her Lily, because her form was as fragile and her cheek almost as pale. As they passed hand in hand down the avenue of drooping elms that led from the portal of Lilias Fay's paternal mansion, they seemed to glance like winged creatures through the strips of sunshine, and to scatter brightness where the deep shadows fell. But, setting forth at the same time with this youthful pair, there was a dismal figure wrapped in a black velvet cloak that might have been made of a coffin pall, and with a sombre hat such as mourners wear drooping its broad brim over his heavy brows. Glancing behind him, the lovers well knew who it was that followed, but wished from their hearts that he had been elsewhere, as being a companion so strangely unsuited to their joyous errand. It was a near relative of Lilias Fay, an old man by the name of Walter Gascoigne, who had long labored under the burden of a melancholy spirit, which was sometimes maddened into absolute insanity, and always had a tinge of it. What a contrast between the young pilgrims of bliss and their unbidden associates! They looked as if molded of heaven's sunshine, and he of earth's gloomiest shade. They flitted along like hope and joy roaming hand in hand through life, while his darksome figure stalked behind, a type of all the woeful influences which life could fling upon them. But the three had not gone far when they reached a spot that pleased the gentle Lily, and she paused. "What sweeter place shall we find than this?" said she. "Why should we seek farther for the site of our temple?" It was indeed a delightful spot of earth, though undistinguished by any very prominent beauties, being nearly a nook in the shelter of a hill, with the prospect of a distant lake in one direction and of a church spire in another. There were vistas and pathways leading onward and onward into the green woodlands and vanishing away in the glimmering shade. The temple, if erected here, would look toward the west, so that the lovers could shape all sorts of magnificent dreams out of the purple, violet, and gold of the sunset sky, and few of their anticipated pleasures were dearer than this sport of fantasy. "Yes," said Adam Forrester, "we might seek all day and find no lovelier spot. We will build our temple here." But their sad old companion, who had taken his stand on the very site which they proposed to cover with a marble floor, shook his head and frowned, and the young man and the lily deemed it almost enough to blight the spot and desecrate it for their airy temple that his dismal figure had thrown its shadow there. He pointed to some scattered stones, the remnants of a former structure, and to flowers such as young girls delight to nurse in their gardens, but which had now relapsed into the wild simplicity of nature. "Not here," cried old Walter Gascoigne. "Here, long ago, other mortals built their temple of happiness. Seek another site for yours." "What?" exclaimed Lilias Fay. "Have any ever planned such a temple save ourselves?" "Poor child," said her gloomy kinsman. "In one shape or other every mortal has dreamed your dream." Then he told the lovers how, not indeed an antique temple, but a dwelling, had once stood there, and that a dark-clad guest had dwelt among its inmates, sitting forever at the fireside and poisoning all their household mirth. Under this type, Adam Forrester and Lilias saw that the old man spake of sorrow. He told of nothing that might not be recorded in the history of almost every household, and yet his hearers felt as if no sunshine ought to fall upon a spot where human grief had left so deep a stain, or at least that no joyous temple should be built there. "This is very sad," said the lily, sighing. "Well, there are lovelier spots than this," said Adam Forrester soothingly, "spots which sorrow has not blighted." So they hastened away, and the melancholy Gascoigne followed them, looking as if he had gathered up all the gloom of the deserted spot and was bearing it as a burden of inestimable treasure. But still they rambled on, and soon found themselves in a rocky dell, through the midst of which ran a streamlet with ripple and foam and a continual voice of inarticulate joy. It was a wild retreat, walled on either side with gray precipices, which would have frowned somewhat too sternly had not a profusion of green shrubbery rooted itself into their crevices and wreathed gladsome foliage around their solemn brows. But the chief joy of the dell was in the little stream, which seemed like the presence of a blissful child with nothing earthly to do save to babble merrily and disport itself, and make every living soul its playfellow, and throw the sunny gleams of its spirit upon all. "Now here is the spot," cried the two lovers with one voice, as they reached a level space on the brink of a small cascade. "This glen was made on purpose for our temple, and the glad song of the brook will always be in our ears," said Lilias Fay. "And the long melody shall sing the bliss of our lifetime," said Adam Forrester. "He must build no temple here," murmured their dismal companion. And there again was the old lunatic, standing just on the spot where they meant to rear their lightsome dome, and looked like the embodied symbol of some great woe that in forgotten days had happened there. And, alas, there had been woe, nor that alone. A young man more than 100 years before had lured hither a girl that loved him, and on this spot had murdered her, and washed his bloody hands in the stream which sang so merrily, and ever since The victim's death shrieks were often heard to echo between the cliffs. "And see," cried old Gascoigne, "is the stream yet pure from the stain of the murderer's hands?" "Methinks it has a tinge of blood," faintly answered the Lily, and being as slight as the gossamer, she trembled and clung to her lover's arm, whispering, "Let us flee from this dreadful vale." "Come, then," said Adam Forrester, as cheerily as he could, "we shall find a happier spot." They set forth again, young pilgrims on that quest which millions, which every child of earth, has tried in turn. And were the Lily and her lover to be more fortunate than all those millions? For a long time it seemed not so. The dismal shape of the old lunatic still glided behind them, and for every spot that looked lovely in their eyes he had some legend of human wrong or suffering so miserably sad that his auditors could never afterward connect the idea of joy with the place where it had happened. Here a heartbroken woman kneeling to her child had been spurned from his feet. Here a desolate old creature had prayed to the Evil One and had received a fiendish malignity of soul in answer to her prayer. Here a new-born infant, sweet blossom of life, had been found dead with the impress of its mother's fingers round its throat. And here, under a shattered oak, two lovers had been stricken by lightning and fell blackened corpses in each other's arms. The dreary Gascoigne had a gift to know whatever evil and lamentable thing had stained the bosom of Mother Earth, and when his funereal voice had told the tale, it appeared like a prophecy of future woe as well as a tradition of the past. And now, by their sad demeanour, you would have fancied that the pilgrim lovers were seeking, not a temple of earthly joy, but a tomb for themselves and their posterity. "Where in this world," exclaimed Adam Forrester despondingly, "shall we build our temple of happiness?" "Where in this world, indeed?" repeated Lilias Fay, and being faint and weary, the more so by the heaviness of her heart, the Lily drooped her head and sat down on the summit of a knoll, repeating, "Where in this world shall we build our temple?" "Ah, have you already asked yourselves that question?" said their companion, his shaded features growing even gloomier with the smile that dwelt on them. "Yet there is a place even in this world where you may build it." While the old man spoke, Adam Forrester and Lilias had carelessly thrown their eyes around and perceived that the spot where they had chanced to pause possessed a quiet charm which was well enough adapted to their present mood of mind. It was a small rise of ground with a certain regularity of shape that had perhaps been bestowed by art, and a group of trees which almost surrounded it threw their pensive shadows across and far beyond, although some softened glory of the sunshine found its way there. The ancestral mansion wherein the lovers would dwell together appeared on one side, and the ivied church where they were to worship on another. Happening to cast their eyes on the ground, they smiled, yet with a sense of wonder, to see that a pale lily was growing at their feet. "We will build our temple here," said they simultaneously, and with an indescribable conviction that they had at last found the very spot. Yet while they uttered this exclamation, the young man and the Lily turned an apprehensive glance at their dreary associate, deeming it hardly possible that some tale of earthly affliction should not make those precincts loathsome, as in every former case. The old man stood just behind them, so as to form the chief figure in the group, with his sable cloak muffling the lower part of his visage, and his sombre hat overshadowing his brows. But he gave no word of dissent from their purpose, and an inscrutable smile was accepted by the lovers as a token that here had been no footprint of guilt or sorrow to desecrate the site of their temple of happiness. In a little time longer, while summer was still in its prime, the fairy structure of the temple arose on the summit of the knoll amid the solemn shadows of the trees, yet often gladdened with bright sunshine. It was built of white marble, with slender and graceful pillars supporting a vaulted dome, and beneath the centre of this dome, upon a pedestal, was a slab of dark-veined marble, on which books and music might be strewn. But there was a fantasy among the people of the neighborhood that the edifice was planned after an ancient mausoleum and was intended for a tomb, and that the central slab of dark-veined marble was to be inscribed with the names of buried ones. They doubted, too, whether the form of Lilias Fay could appertain to a creature of this earth, being so very delicate and growing every day more fragile, so that it looked as if the summer breeze would snatch her up and waft her heavenward. But still she watched the daily growth of the temple, and so did old Walter Gascoigne, who now made that spot his continual haunt, leaning whole hours together on his staff, and giving as deep attention to the work as though it had been indeed a tomb. In due time it was finished, and a day appointed for a simple rite of dedication. On the preceding evening, after Adam Forrester had taken leave of his mistress, he looked back toward the portal of her dwelling, and felt a strange thrill of fear, for he imagined that as the setting sunbeams faded from her figure she was exhaling away, and that something of her ethereal substance was withdrawn with each lessening gleam of light. With his farewell glance a shadow had fallen over the portal, and Lilias was invisible. His foreboding spirit deemed it an omen at the time, and so it proved, for the sweet earthly form by which the lily had been manifested to the world was found lifeless the next morning in the temple, with her head resting on her arms, which were folded upon the slab of dark-veined marble. The chill winds of the earth had long since breathed a blight into this beautiful flower. The chill winds of the earth had long since breathed a blight into this beautiful flower, so that a loving hand had now transplanted it to blossom brightly in the garden of paradise. But alas for the temple of happiness! In his unutterable grief, Adam Forrester had no purpose more at heart than to convert this temple of many delightful hopes into a tomb and bury his dead mistress there. And lo, a wonder! Digging a grave beneath the temple's marble floor, the sexton found no virgin earth such as was meet to receive the maiden's dust, but an ancient sepulchre in which were treasured up the bones of generations that had died long ago. Among these forgotten answers was the lily to be laid, and when the funeral procession brought Lilias thither in her coffin, they beheld old Walter Gascoigne standing beneath the dome of the temple with his cloak of pall and face of darkest gloom, and wherever that figure might take its stand the spot would seem a sepulchre. He watched the mourners as they lowered the coffin down. "And so," said he to Adam Forrester, with the strange smile in which his insanity was wont to gleam forth, "you have found no better foundation for your happiness than on a grave?" But as the shadow of affliction spoke, a vision of hope and joy had its birth in Adam's mind, even from the old man's taunting words, for then he knew what was betokened by the parable in which the lily and himself had acted, and the mystery of life and death was opened to him. "Joy! Joy!" he cried, throwing his arms toward heaven. "On a grave be the site of our temple, and now our happiness is for eternity." With those words a ray of sunshine broke through the dismal sky and glimmered down into the sepulchre, while at the same moment the shape of old Walter Gascoigne stalked drearily away, because his gloom, symbolic of all earthly sorrow, might no longer abide there, now that the darkest riddle of humanity was read. End of The Lily's Quest. Footprints on the Seashore, from Twice Told Tales by Nathaniel Hawthorne. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Bob Neufeld. It must be a spirit much unlike my own which can keep itself in health and vigor without sometimes stealing from the sultry sunshine of the world to plunge into the cool bath of solitude. At intervals, and not infrequent ones, the forest and the ocean summon me, one with the roar of its waves, the other with the murmur of its boughs, forth from the haunts of man. But I must wander many a mile ere I could stand beneath the shadow of even one primeval tree, much less be lost among the multitude of hoary trunks and hidden from the earth and sky by the mystery of darksome foliage. Nothing is within my daily reach more like a forest than the acre or two of woodland near some suburban farmhouse. When, therefore, the yearning of seclusion becomes a necessity within me, I am drawn to the seashore, which extends its line of rude rocks and seldom trodden sands for leagues around our bay. Setting forth on my last ramble on a September morning, I bound myself with a hermit's vow to interchange no thoughts with man or woman, to share no social pleasure, but to derive all that day's enjoyment from shore and sea and sky, from my soul's communion with these, and from fantasies and recollections or anticipated realities. Surely here is enough to feed a human spirit for a single day. Farewell, then, busy world, till your evening lights shall shine along the street, till they gleam upon my sea-flushed face as I tread homeward. Free me from your ties, and let me be a peaceful outlaw. Highways and cross-paths are hastily traversed, and climbing down a crag, I find myself at the extremity of a long beach. How gladly does the spirit leap forth and suddenly enlarge its sense of being to the full extent of the broad blue sunny deep. A greeting and a homage to the sea. I descend over its margin and dip my hand into the wave that meets me and bathe my brow. That far-resounding roar is ocean's voice of welcome. His salt breath brings a blessing along with it. Now let us pace together, the reader's fancy arm in arm with mine, this noble beach, which extends a mile or more from that craggy promontory to yonder rampart of broken rocks. In front, the sea. In the rear, a precipitous bank, the grassy verge of which is breaking away year after year, and flings down its tufts of verdure upon the barrenness below. The beach itself is a broad space of sand, brown and sparkling, with hardly any pebbles intermixed. Near the water's edge there is a wet margin which glistens brightly in the sunshine and reflects objects like a mirror, and as we tread along the glistening border, a dry spot flashes around each footstep, but grows moist again as we lift our feet. In some spots the sand receives a complete impression of the sole, square toe and all. Elsewhere it is of such marble firmness that we must stamp heavily to leave a print even of the iron-shod heel. Along the whole of this extensive beach gambols the surf-wave. Now it makes a feint of dashing onward in a fury, yet dies away with a meek murmur and does but kiss the strand. Now, after many such abortive efforts, it rears itself up in an unbroken line, heightening as it advances, without a speck of foam on its green crest. With how fierce a roar it flings itself forward and rushes far up the beach. As I threw my eyes along the edge of the surf, I remember that I was startled, as Robinson Crusoe might have been, by the sense that human life was within the magic circle of my solitude. Afar off in the remote distance of the beach, appearing like sea nymphs or some airier things such as might tread upon the feathery spray, was a group of girls. Hardly had I beheld them when they passed into the shadow of the rocks and vanished. To comfort myself, for truly I would fain have gazed a while longer, I made acquaintance with a flock of beach birds. These little citizens of the sea and air preceded me by about a stone's throw along the strand, seeking, I suppose, for food upon its margin. Yet, with a philosophy which mankind could well do to imitate, they drew a continual pleasure from their toil for a subsistence. The sea was each little bird's great playmate. They chased it downward as it swept back, and again ran up swiftly before the impending wave, which sometimes overtook them and bore them off their feet. But they floated as lightly as one of their own feathers on the breaking crest. In their airy flutterings they seemed to rest on the evanescent spray. Their images, long-legged little figures with grey backs and snowy bosoms, were seen as distinctly as the realities in the mirror of the glistening strand. As I advanced, they flew a score or two of yards, and again alighting, recommenced their dalliance with the surf-wave, and thus they bore me company along the beach, the types of pleasant fantasies, till at its extremity they took wing over the ocean and were gone. After forming a friendship with these small surf spirits, it is really worth a sigh to find no memorial to them save their multitudinous little tracks in the sand. When we have paced the length of the beach, it is pleasant and not unprofitable to retrace our steps and recall the whole mood and occupation of the mind during the former passage. Our tracks, being all discernible, will guide us with an observing consciousness through every unconscious wandering of thought and fancy. Here we followed the surf in its reflux to pick up a shell which the sea seemed loath to relinquish. Here we found a seaweed with an immense brown leaf, and trailed it behind us by its long snake-like stalk. Here we seized a live horseshoe by the tail, and counted the many claws of that queer monster. Here we dug into the sand for pebbles, and skipped them upon the surface of the water. Here we wet our feet while examining a jelly-fish which the waves, having just tossed it up, now sought to snatch it away again. Here we trod along the brink of a fresh-water brooklet which flows across the beach, becoming shallower and more shallow till at last it sinks into the sand and perishes in the effort to bear its little tribute to the main. Here some vagary appears to have bewildered us, for our tracks go round and round, and are confusedly intermingled, as if we had found a labyrinth upon the level beach. And here, amid the idle pastime, we sat down upon almost the only stone that breaks the surface of the sand, and were lost in an unlooked-for and overpowering conception of the majesty and awfulness of the great deep. Thus, by tracking our footprints in the sand, we track our own nature in its wayward course, and steal a glance upon it when it never dreams of being so observed. Such glances always make us wiser. This extensive beach affords room for another pleasant pastime. With your staff you may write verses, love verses, if they please you best, and consecrate them with a woman's name. Here, too, may be inscribed thoughts, feelings, desires, warm outgushings from the heart's secret places, which you would not pour upon the sand without the certainty that almost ere the sky has looked upon them, the sea will wash them out. Stir not hence till the record be effaced. Now, for there is room enough on your canvas, draw huge faces, huge as that of the Sphinx on Egyptian sands, and fit them with bodies of corresponding immensity, and legs which might stride half-way to yonder island. Child's play becomes magnificent on so grand a scale. But, after all, the most fascinating employment is simply to write your name in the sand. Draw the letters gigantic, so that 2 strides may barely measure them, and 3 for the long strokes. Cut deep, that the record may be permanent. Statesmen and warriors and poets have spent their strength in no better cause than this. Is it accomplished? Return then in an hour or 2, and seek for this mighty record of a name. The sea will be swept over it, even as time rolls its effacing waves over the names of statesmen and warriors and poets. Hark! The surf wave laughs at you. Passing from the beach, I begin to clamber over the crags, making my difficult way among the ruins of a rampart shattered and broken by the assaults of a fierce enemy. The rocks rise in every variety of attitude. Some of them have their feet in the foam and are shagged half-way upward with seaweed. Some have been hollowed almost into caverns by the unwearied toil of the sea, which can afford to spend centuries in wearing away a rock, or even polishing a pebble. One huge rock ascends in monumental shape, with a face like a giant's tombstone, on which the veins resemble inscriptions, but in an unknown tongue. We will fancy them the forgotten characters of an antediluvian race, or else that nature's own hand has here recorded a mystery which, could I read her language, would make mankind the wiser and the happier. How many a thing has troubled me with that same idea! Pass on and leave it unexplained. Here is a narrow avenue, which might seem to have been hewn through the very heart of an enormous crag, offering passage for the rising sea to thunder back and forth, filling it with tumultuous foam, and then leaving its floor of black pebbles bare and glistening. In this chasm there was once an interesting vein of softer stone, which the waves have gnawed away piecemeal, while the granite walls remained entire on either side. How sharply and with what harsh clamor does the sea rake back the pebbles as it momentarily withdraws into its own depths! At intervals the floor of the chasm is left nearly dry, but anon, at the outlet, 2 or 3 great waves are seen struggling to get in at once. 2 hit the walls athwart, while 1 rushes straight through, and all 3 thunder as if with rage and triumph. They heap the chasm with a snowdrift of foam and spray. While watching this scene, I can never rid myself of the idea that a monster endowed with life and fierce energy is striving to burst his way through the narrow pass. And what a contrast to look through the stormy chasm and catch a glimpse of the calm, bright sea beyond! Many interesting discoveries may be made among these broken cliffs. Once, for example, I found a dead seal which a recent tempest had tossed into the nook of the rocks, where his shaggy carcass lay rolled in a heap of eel-grass, as if the sea-monster sought to hide himself from my eye. Another time a shark seemed on the point of leaping from the surf to swallow me, nor did I wholly without dread approach near enough to ascertain that the man-eater had already met his own death from some fisherman in the bay. In the same ramble I encountered a bird, a large gray bird, but whether a loon or a wild goose or the identical albatross of the Ancient Mariner was beyond my ornithology to decide. It reposed so naturally on a bed of dry seaweed, with its head beside its wing, that I almost fancied it alive, and trod softly lest it should suddenly spread its wings skyward. But the sea-bird would soar among the clouds no more, nor ride upon its native waves. So I drew near and pulled out one of its mottled tail-feathers for a remembrance. Another day I discovered an immense bone wedged into a chasm of the rocks. It was at least 10 feet long, curved like a scimitar, bejewelled with barnacles and small shellfish, and partly covered with a growth of seaweed. Some leviathan of former ages had used this ponderous mass as a jawbone. Curiosities of a minuter order may be observed in a deep reservoir which is replenished with water at every tide, but becomes a lake among the crags save when the sea is at its height. At the bottom of this rocky basin grow marine plants, some of which tower high beneath the water and cast a shadow in the sunshine. Small fishes dart to and fro and hide themselves among the seaweed. There is a solitary crab who appears to lead the life of a hermit, communing with none of the other denizens of the place, and likewise several five-fingers, for I know no other name than that which children give them. If your imagination be at all accustomed to such freaks, you may look down into the depths of this pool and fancy it the mysterious depth of ocean. But where are the hulks and scattered timbers of sunken ships? Where the treasures that old ocean hoards? Where the corroded cannon? Where the corpses and skeletons of seamen who went down in storm and battle? On the day of my last ramble, it was a September day, yet as warm as summer, what should I behold as I approached the above described basin but 3 girls sitting on its margin, and, yes, it is veritably so, laying their snowy feet in the sunny water. These are the warm realities of those 3 visionary shapes that flitted from me on the beach. Hark their merry voices as they toss up the water with their feet. They have not seen me. I must shrink behind this rock and steal away again. In honest truth, as vowed to solitude as I am, there is something in this encounter that makes the heart flutter with a strangely pleasant sensation. I know these girls to be realities of flesh and blood, yet glancing at them so briefly, they mingle like kindred creatures with the ideal beings of my mind. It is pleasant, likewise, to gaze down from some high crag and watch a group of children gathering pebbles and pearly shells and playing with the surf as with old ocean's hoary beard. Nor does it infringe upon my seclusion to see yonder boat at anchor off the shore, swinging dreamily to and fro and rising and sinking with the alternate swell, while the crew, 4 gentlemen in roundabout jackets, are busy with their fishing lines. But with an inward antipathy and a headlong flight do I eschew the presence of any meditative stroller like myself, known by his pilgrim staff, his sauntering step, his shy demeanor, his observant yet abstracted eye. From such a man, as if another self had scared me, I scramble hastily over the rocks, and take refuge in a nook which many a secret hour has given me a right to call my own. I would do battle for it even with the churl that should produce the title deeds. Have not my musings melted into its rocky walls and sandy floor and made them a portion of myself? It is a recess in the line of cliffs walled round by a rough high precipice which almost encircles and shuts in a little space of sand. In front the sea appears as between the pillars of a portal. In the rear the precipice is broken and intermixed with earth, which gives nourishment not only to clinging and twining shrubs, but to trees that grip the rock with their naked roots and seem to struggle hard for footing and for soil enough to live upon. These are fir trees, but oaks hang their heavy branches from above and throw down acorns on the beach and shed their withering foliage upon the waves. At this autumnal season the precipice is decked with variegated splendor. Trailing wreaths of scarlet flaunt from the summit downward. Tufts of yellow-flowering shrubs and rose-bushes, with their reddened leaves and glossy seed-berries, sprout from each crevice. At every glance I detect some new light or shade of beauty, all contrasting with the stern gray rock. A rill of water trickles down the cliff and fills a little cistern near the base. I drain it as a draught, and find it fresh and pure. This recess shall be my dining hall. And what the feast? a few biscuits, made savory by soaking them in sea water, a tuft of samphire gathered from the beach, and an apple for the dessert. By this time the little rill has filled its reservoir again, and as I quaff it, I thank God more heartily than for a civic banquet that he gives me the healthy appetite to make a feast of bread and water. Dinner being over, I throw myself at length upon the sand, and, basking in the sunshine, let my mind disport itself at will. The walls of this my hermitage have no tongue to tell my follies, though I sometimes fancy that they have ears to hear them and a soul to sympathize. There is magic in this spot. Dreams haunt its precincts and flit around me in broad sunlight, nor require that sleep shall blindfold me to real objects ere these be visible. Here I can frame a story of two lovers, and make their shadows live before me, and be mirrored in the tranquil water as they tread along the sand, leaving no footprints. Here, should I will it, I can summon up a single shade, and be myself her lover. Yes, dreamer, but your lonely heart will be the colder for such fancies. Sometimes, too, the past comes back and finds me here, and in her train come faces which were gladsome when I knew them, yet seem not gladsome now. Would that my hiding-place were lonelier, so that the past might not find me. Get ye all gone, old friends, and let me listen to the murmur of the sea. A melancholy voice, but less sad than yours. Of what mysteries is it telling? Of sunken ships and whereabouts they lie, of islands afar and undiscovered, whose tawny children are unconscious of other islands and of continents, and deem the stars of heaven their nearest neighbors? Nothing of all this. What then? Has it talked for so many ages and meant nothing all the while? No. For those ages find utterance in the sea's unchanging voice, and warn the listener to withdraw his interest from mortal vicissitudes, and let the infinite idea of eternity pervade his soul. This is wisdom, and therefore will I spend the next half-hour in shaping little boats of driftwood and launching them on voyages across the cove, with the feather of a sea-gull for a sail. If the voice of ages tell me true, this is as wise an occupation as to build ships of 500 tons and launch them forth upon the main, bound to far Cathay. Yet how would the merchant sneer at me? And, after all, can such philosophy be true? Methinks I could find 1,000 arguments against it. Well, then, let yonder shaggy rock mid-deep in the surf. See, he is somewhat wrathful. He rages and roars and foams. Let that tall rock be my antagonist, and let me exercise my oratory like him of Athens who bandied words with an angry sea and got the victory. My maiden speech is a triumphant one, for the gentleman in seaweed has nothing to offer in reply save an immitigable roaring. His voice, indeed, will be heard a long while after mine is hushed. Once more I shout, and the cliffs reverberate the sound. Oh, what joy for a shy man to feel himself so solitary that he may lift his voice to its highest pitch without hazard of a listener. But hush! Be silent, my good friend. Whence comes that stifled laughter? It was musical, but how should there be such music in my solitude? Looking upward, I catch a glimpse of 3 faces peeping from the summit of a cliff like angels between me and their native sky. Ah, fair girls, you make yourself merry at my eloquence, but it was my turn to smile when I saw your white feet in the pool. Let us keep each other's secrets. The sunshine has now passed from my hermitage, except a gleam upon the sand just where it meets the sea. A crowd of gloomy fantasies will come and haunt me if I tarry longer here in the darkening twilight of these gray rocks. This is a dismal place in some moods of the mind. Climb we, therefore, the precipice, and pause a moment on the brink, gazing down into the hollow chamber by the deep, where we have been what few can be, sufficient to our own pastime. Yes, say the word outright, self-sufficient to our own happiness. How lonesome looks the recess now, and dreary too, like all other spots where happiness has been. There lies my shadow in the departing sunshine, with its head upon the sea. I will pelt it with pebbles. A hit! I clap my hands in triumph, and see my shadow clapping its unreal hands and claiming the triumph for itself. What a simpleton must I have been all day, since my own shadow makes a mock of my fooleries. Homeward, homeward! It is time to hasten home. It is time. It is time. For as the sun sinks over the western wave, the sea grows melancholy, and the surf has a saddened tone. The distant sails appear astray, and not of earth, in their remoteness amid the desolate waste. My spirit wanders afar, but finds no resting place, and comes shivering back. It is time that I were hence. But grudge me not the day that has been spent in seclusion, which yet was not solitude, since the great sea has been my companion, and the little sea-birds my friends, and the wind has told me its secrets, and airy shapes have flitted around me in my hermitage. Such companionship works an effect upon a man's character as if he had been admitted to the society of creatures that are not mortal. And when, at noontide, I tread the crowded streets, the influence of this day will still be felt, so that I shall walk among men kindly and as a brother, with affection and sympathy, but yet shall not melt into the indistinguishable mass of humankind. I shall think my own thoughts and feel my own emotions, and possess my individuality unviolated. But it is good at the eve of such a day to feel and know that there are men and women in the world. That feeling and that knowledge are mine at this moment, far on the shore, for below me the fishing party have landed from their skiff and are cooking their scaly prey by the fire of a driftwood kindled in the angle of two rude rocks. The three visionary girls are likewise there. In the deepening twilight, while the surf is dashing near their hearth, the ruddy gleam of the fire throws a strange air of comfort over the wild cove, bestrewn as it is with pebbles and seaweed, and exposed to the melancholy main. Moreover, as the smoke climbs up the precipice, it brings with it a savory smell from a pan of fried fish and a black kettle of chowder, and reminds me that my dinner was nothing but bread and water, and a tuft of samphire and an apple. Methinks the party might find room for another guest at that flat rock which serves them for a table, and if spoons be scarce, I could pick up a clam-shell on the beach. They see me now, and, the blessing of a hungry man upon them, one of them sends up a hospitable shout. "Hallo, Sir Solitary, come down and sup with us." The ladies wave their handkerchiefs. Can I decline? No, and be it owned, after all my solitary joys, that this is the sweetest moment of the day by the seashore. End of Footprints on the Seashore. Edward Fane's Rosebud, from Twice Told Tales by Nathaniel Hawthorne. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Bob Neufeld. There is hardly a more difficult exercise of fancy than, while gazing at a figure of melancholy age, to recreate its youth, and without entirely obliterating the identity of form and features, to restore those graces which time has snatched away. Some old people, especially women, so age-worn and woeful are they, seem never to have been young and gay. It is easier to conceive that such gloomy phantoms were sent into the world as withered and decrepit as we behold them now, with sympathies only for pain and grief, to watch at death-beds and weep at funerals. Even the sable garments of their widowhood appear essential in their existence. All their attributes combine to render them darksome shadows creeping strangely amid the sunshine of human life. Yet it is no unprofitable task to take one of these doleful creatures and set fancy resolutely at work to brighten the dim eye and darken the silvery locks, and paint the ashen cheek with rose-color, and repair the shrunken and crazy form, till a dewy maiden shall be seen in the old matron's elbow-chair. The miracle being wrought, then let the years roll back again, each sadder than the last, and the whole weight of age and sorrow settle down upon the youthful figure. Wrinkles and furrows, the handwriting of time, may thus be deciphered and found to contain deep lessons of thought and feeling. Such profit may be derived by a skilful observer from my much-respected friend, the widow Toothaker, a nurse of great repute, who has breathed the atmosphere of sick chambers and dying breaths these 40 years. See, she sits cowering over her lonesome hearth with her grown and upper petticoat drawn upward, gathering thriftily into her person the whole warmth of the fire which now at nightfall begins to dissipate the autumnal chill of her chamber. The blaze quivers capriciously in front, alternately glimmering into the deepest chasms of the wrinkled visage, and then permitting a ghostly dimness to mar the outlines of her venerable figure. And Nurse Toothaker holds a teaspoon in her right hand with which to stir up the contents of a tumbler in her left, whence steams a vapory fragrance abhorred of temperance societies. Now she sips, now she stirs, now sips again. Her sad old heart has need to be revived by the rich infusion of Geneva, which is mixed half and half with hot water in the tumbler. All day long she has been sitting by a death-pillow, and quitted it for her home only when the spirit of her patient left the clay and went homeward too. But now are her melancholy meditations cheered, and her torpid blood warmed, and her shoulders lightened of at least 20 ponderous years by a draught from the true fountain of youth in a case bottle. It is strange that men should deem that fount a fable, when its liquor fills more bottles than the Congress water. Sip it again, good nurse, and see whether a second draught will take off another score of years, and perhaps 10 more, and show us in your high-backed chair the blooming damsel who plighted troths with Edward Fane. Get you gone, age and widowhood. Come back, unwedded youth. But, alas, the charm will not work. In spite of fancy's most potent spell, I can see only an old dame cowering over the fire, a picture of decay and desolation, while the November blast roars at her in the chimney, and fitful showers rush suddenly against the window. Yet there was a time when Rose Grafton, such was the pretty maiden name of Nurse Toothaker, possessed beauty that would have gladdened this dim and dismal chamber as with sunshine. It won for her the heart of Edward Fane, who has since made so great a figure in the world, and is now a grand old gentleman, with powdered hair, and as gouty as a lord. These early lovers thought to have walked hand in hand through life. They had wept together for Edward's little sister Mary, whom Rose tended in her sickness, partly because she was the sweetest child that ever lived or died, but more for love of him. She was but 3 years old. being such an infant, death could not embody his terrors in her little corpse, nor did Rose fear to touch the dead child's brow, though chill as she curled the silken hair around it, nor to take her tiny hand and clasp a flower within its fingers. Afterward, when she looked through the pane of glass in the coffin lid and beheld Mary's face, it seemed not so much like death or life as a waxwork wrought into the perfect image of a child, asleep and dreaming of its mother's smile. Rose thought her too fair a thing to be hidden in the grave, and wondered that an angel did not snatch up little Mary's coffin and bear the slumbering babe to heaven and bid her wake immortal. But when the sods were laid on little Mary, the heart of Rose was troubled. She shuddered at the fantasy that in grasping the child's cold fingers her virgin hand had exchanged a first greeting with mortality, and could never lose the earthy taint. How many a greeting since! But as yet she was a fair young girl with the dewdrops of fresh feeling in her bosom, and instead of Rose, which seemed too mature a name for her half-opened beauty, her lover called her Rosebud. The rosebud was destined never to bloom for Edward Fane. His mother was a rich and haughty dame with all the aristocratic prejudices of colonial times. She scorned Rose Grafton's humble parentage, and caused her son to break his faith, though, had she let him choose, he would have prized his rosebud above the richest diamond. The lovers parted, and have seldom met again. Both may have visited the same mansions, but not at the same time, for one was bidden to the festal hall and the other to the sick chamber. He was the guest of pleasure and prosperity, and she of anguish. Rose, after their separation, was long secluded within the dwelling of Mr. Toothaker, whom she married with the revengeful hope of breaking her false lover's heart. She went to her bridegroom's arms with bitterer tears, they say, than young girls ought to shed at the threshold of the bridal chamber. Yet, though her husband's head was getting gray, and his heart had been chilled with an autumnal frost, Rose soon began to love him, and wondered at her own conjugal affection. He was all she had to love. There were no children. In a year or two, poor Mr. Toothaker was visited with a wearisome infirmity which settled in his joints and made him weaker than a child. He crept forth about his business, and came home at dinner-time and eventide, not with the manly tread that gladdens a wife's heart, but slowly, feebly jotting down each dull footstep with a melancholy dub of his staff. We must pardon his pretty wife if she sometimes blushed to own him. Her visitors looked for the appearance of some old man, but he dragged his nerveless limbs into the parlor, and there was Mr. Toothaker. The disease increasing, he never went into the sunshine save with a staff in his right hand and his left on his wife's shoulder, bearing heavily downward like a dead man's hand. Thus, a slender woman, still looking maiden-like, she supported his tall, broad-chested frame along the pathway of their little garden, and plucked the roses for her gray-haired husband, and spoke soothingly as to an infant. His mind was palsied with his body. Its utmost energy was peevishness. In a few months more she helped him up the staircase with a pause at every step, and a longer one upon the landing-place, and a heavy glance behind as he crossed the threshold of his chamber. He knew, poor man, that the precincts of those 4 walls would thenceforth be his world, his home, his tomb, at once a dwelling and a burial-place, till he were borne to a darker and a narrower one. But Rose was with him in the tomb. He leaned upon her in his daily passage from the bed to the chair by the fireside, and back again from the weary chair to the joyless bed, his bed and hers, their marriage bed, till even this short journey ceased, and his head lay all day upon the pillow, and hers all night beside it. How long poor Mr. Toothaker was kept in misery! Death seemed to draw near the door, and often to lift the latch, and sometimes to thrust its ugly skull into his chamber, nodding to Rose and pointing at her husband, but still delayed to enter. "This bedridden wretch cannot escape me," quoth Death. "I will go forth and run a race with the swift, and fight a battle with the strong, and come back for Toothaker at my leisure." Oh, when the deliverer came so near, in the dull anguish of her worn-out sympathies, did she never long to cry, "Death, come in"? But no, we have no right to ascribe such a wish to our friend Rose. She never failed in a wife's duty to her poor sick husband. She murmured not, though a glimpse of the sunny sky was as strange to her as him, nor answered peevishly, though his complaining accents roused her from sweetest dream only to share his wretchedness. He knew her faith, yet nourished a cankered jealousy, and when the slow disease had chilled all his heart save one lukewarm spot which Death's frozen fingers were searching for, his last words were, "What would my Rose have done for her first love, if she has been so true and kind to a sick old man like me?" And then his poor soul crept away and left the body lifeless, though hardly more so than for years before, and Rose a widow, though in truth it was the wedding night that widowed her. She felt glad, it must be owned, when Mr. Toothaker was buried, because his corpse had retained such a likeness to the man half alive that she hearkened for the sad murmur of his voice bidding her shift his pillow. But all through the next winter, though the grave had held him many a month, she fancied him calling from that cold bed, "Rose, Rose, come put a blanket on my feet." So now the Rosebud was the widow Toothaker. Her troubles had come early, and, tedious as they seemed, had passed before all her bloom was fled. She was still fair enough to capture a bachelor, or with a widow's cheerful gravity she might have won a widower, stealing into his heart in the very guise of his dead wife. But the widow Toothaker had no such projects. By her watchings and continual cares her heart had become knit to her first husband with a constancy which charged its very nature, and made her love him for his infirmities, and infirmity for his sake. When the palsied old man was gone, even her early lover could not have supplied his place. She had dwelt in a sick chamber and been the companion of a half-dead wretch till she could scarcely breathe in a free air, and felt ill at ease with the healthy and the happy. She missed the fragrance of the doctor's stuff. She walked the chamber with a noiseless footfall. If visitors came in, she spoke in soft and soothing accents, and was startled and shocked by their loud voices. Often in the lonesome evening she looked timorously from the fireside to the bed, with almost a hope of recognizing a ghastly face upon the pillow. Then went her thoughts sadly to her husband's grave. If one impatient throb had wronged him in his lifetime, if she had secretly repined because her buoyant youth was imprisoned with his torpid age, if ever, while slumbering beside him, a treacherous dream had admitted another into her heart, yet the sick man had been preparing a revenge which the dead now claimed. On his painful pillow he had cast a spell around her. His groans and misery had proved more captivating charms than gaiety and youthful grace. In his semblance, disease itself had won the Rosebud for a bride, nor could his death dissolve the nuptials. By that indissoluble bond she had gained a home in every sick chamber, and nowhere else. There were her brethren and sisters. Thither her husband summoned her with that voice which had seemed to issue from the grave of Toothaker. At length she recognized her destiny. We have beheld her as the maid, the wife, the widow. Now we see her in a separate and insulated character. She was, in all her attributes, Nurse Toothaker. And Nurse Toothaker alone, with her own shriveled lips, could make known her experience in that capacity. What a history might she record of the great sicknesses in which she has gone hand in hand with the exterminating angel! She remembers when the smallpox hoisted a red banner on almost every house along the street. She has witnessed when the typhoid fever swept off a whole household, young and old, all but a lonely mother, who vainly shrieked to follow her last loved one. Where would be death's triumph if none lived to weep? She can speak of strange maladies that have broken out as if spontaneously, but were found to have been imported from foreign lands, with rich silks and other merchandise, the costliest portion of the cargo. And once, she recollects, the people died of what was considered a new pestilence, till the doctors traced it to the ancient grave of a young girl, who thus caused many deaths 100 years after her own burial. Strange that such black mischief should lurk in a maiden's grave. She loves to tell how strong men fight with fiery fevers, utterly refusing to give up their breath, and how consumptive virgins fade out of the world, scarcely reluctant, as if their lovers were wooing them to a far country. Tell us, thou fearful woman, tell us the death-secrets. Fain would I search out the meaning of words faintly gasped, with intermingled sobs and broken sentences, half audibly spoken between earth and the judgment-seat. An awful woman. She is the patron saint of young physicians and the bosom friend of old ones. In the mansions where she enters, the inmates provide themselves black garments. The coffin-maker follows her, and the bell tolls as she comes away from the threshold. Death himself has met her at so many a bedside that he puts forth his bony hand to greet Nurse Toothaker. And oh, is it conceivable that this handmaid of human infirmity and affliction, so darkly stained, so thoroughly imbued with all that is saddest in the doom of mortals, can ever again be bright and gladsome, even though bathed in the sunshine of eternity? By her long communion with woe, has she not forfeited her inheritance of immortal joy? Does any germ of bliss survive within her? Hark! An eager knocking at Nurse Toothaker's door. She starts from her drowsy reverie, sets aside the empty tumbler and teaspoon, and lights a lamp at the dim embers of the fire. Rap, rap, rap again, and she hurries adown the staircase, wondering which of her friends can be at death's door now, since there is such an earnest messenger at Nurse Toothaker's. Again the peal resounds just as her hand is on the lock. Be quick, Nurse Toothaker, cries a man on the doorstep. Old General Fane is taken with the gout in his stomach, and has sent for you to watch by his deathbed. Make haste, for there is no time to lose. Fane! Edward Fane! And has he sent for me at last? I am ready. I will get on my cloak and be gone. So, adds the sable-gowned, ashen-visaged, funereal old figure, Edward Fane remembers his Rosebud. Our question is answered. There is a germ of bliss within her. Her long-hoarded constancy, her memory of the bliss that was remaining amid the gloom of her after-life, like a sweet-smelling flower in a coffin, is a symbol that all may be renewed. In some happier clime, the rosebud may revive again, with all the dewdrops in its bosom. End of Edward Fane's Rosebud. The Threefold Destiny, a Fairy Legend, from Twice Told Tales, by Nathaniel Hawthorne. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Bob Neufeld. I have sometimes produced a singular and not unpleasing effect, so far as my own mind was concerned, by imagining a train of incidents in which the spirit and mechanism of the fairy legend should be combined with the characters and manners of familiar life. In the little tale which follows, a subdued tinge of the wild and wonderful is thrown over a sketch of New England personages and scenery. Yet, it is hoped, without entirely obliterating the sober hues of nature. Rather than a story of events claiming to be real, it may be considered as an allegory, such as the writers of the last century would have expressed in the shape of an Eastern tale, but to which I have endeavored to give a more lifelike warmth than could be infused into those fanciful productions. In the twilight of a summer eve, a tall, dark figure, over which long and remote travel had thrown an outlandish aspect, was entering a village not in fairy-land, but within our own familiar boundaries. The staff on which this traveller leaned had been his companion from the spot where it grew in the jungles of Hindostan. The hat that overshadowed his sombre brow had shielded him from the suns of Spain, but his cheek had been blackened by the red-hot wind of an Arabian desert and had felt the frozen breath of an Arctic region. Long sojourning amid wild and dangerous men, he still wore beneath his vest the ataghan which he had once struck into the throat of a Turkish robber. In every foreign clime he had lost something of his New England characteristics, and perhaps from every people he had unconsciously borrowed a new peculiarity, so that when the world-wanderer again trod the street of his native village, it was no wonder that he passed unrecognized, though exciting the gaze and curiosity of all. Yet, as his arm casually touched that of a young woman who was wending her way to an evening lecture, she started and almost uttered a cry. "Ralph Cranfield!" was the name that she half articulated. "Can that be my old playmate, Faith Edgerton?" thought the traveller, looking round at her figure, but without pausing. Ralph Cranfield, from his youth upward, had felt himself marked out for a high destiny. He had imbibed the idea. We say not whether it was revealed to him by witchcraft or in a dream of prophecy, or that his brooding fancy had palmed its own dictates upon him as the oracles of a sibyl, but he had imbibed the idea and held it firmest among his articles of faith that 3 marvelous events of his life were to be confirmed to him by 3 signs. The first of these 3 fatalities, and perhaps the one on which his youthful imagination had dwelt most fondly, was the discovery of the maid who alone of all the maids on earth could make him happy by her love. He was to roam around the world till he should meet a beautiful woman wearing on her bosom a jewel in the shape of a heart. Whether of pearl, or ruby, or emerald, or carbuncle, or a changeful opal, or perhaps a priceless diamond, Ralph Cranfield little cared, so long as it were a heart of one peculiar shape. On encountering this lovely stranger, he was bound to address her thus: "Maiden, I have brought you a heavy heart. May I rest its weight on you?" And if she were his fated bride, if their kindred souls were destined to form a union here below which all eternity should only bind more closely, she would reply, with her finger on the heart-shaped jewel, "This token which I have worn so long is the assurance that you may." And secondly, Ralph Cranfield had a firm belief that there was a mighty treasure hidden somewhere in the earth of which the burial-place would be revealed to none but him. When his feet should press upon the mysterious spot, there would be a hand before him pointing downward, whether carved of marble or hewn in gigantic dimensions on the side of a rocky precipice, or perchance a hand of flame in empty air, he could not tell. But at least he would discern a hand, the forefinger pointing downward, and beneath it the Latin word effode, dig. and digging thereabouts, the gold in coin or ingots, the precious stones, or of whatever else the treasure might consist, would be certain to reward his toil. The third and last of the miraculous events in the life of this high-destined man was to be the attainment of extensive influence and sway over his fellow creatures. Whether he were to be a king and founder of a hereditary throne, or the victorious leader of a people contending for their freedom, or the apostle of a purified and regenerated faith, was left to futurity to show. As messengers of the sign by which Ralph Cranfield might recognize the summons, 3 venerable men were to claim audience of him. The chief among them, a dignified and majestic person arrayed, it may be supposed, in the flowing garments of an ancient sage, would be the bearer of a wand or prophet's rod. With this wand or rod or staff, the venerable sage would trace a certain figure in the air, and then proceed to make known his heaven-instructed message, which, if obeyed, must lead to glorious results. With this proud fate before him, in the flush of his imaginative youth, Ralph Cranfield had set forth to seek the maid, the treasure, and the venerable sage with his gift of extended empire. And had he found them? Alas! It was not with the aspect of a triumphant man who had achieved a nobler destiny than all his fellows, but rather with the gloom of one struggling against peculiar and continual adversity, that he now passed homeward to his mother's cottage. He had come back, but only for a time, to lay aside the pilgrim's staff, trusting that his weary manhood would regain somewhat of the elasticity of youth in the spirit where his threefold fate had been foreshowed him. There had been few changes in the village, for it was not one of those thriving places where a year's prosperity makes more than the havoc of a century's decay, but, like a gray hair in a young man's head, an antiquated little town full of old maids and aged elms and moss-grown dwellings. Few seemed to be the changes here. The drooping elms, indeed, had a more majestic spread. The weather-blackened houses were adorned with a denser thatch of verdant moss, and doubtless there were a few more gravestones in the burial ground inscribed with names that had once been familiar in the village street. Yet, summing up all the mischief that 10 years had wrought, it seemed scarcely more than if Ralph Cranfield had gone forth that very morning and dreamed a daydream till the twilight, and then turned back again. But his heart grew cold because the village did not remember him as he remembered the village. "Here is the change," sighed he, striking his hand upon his breast. "Who is this man of thought and care, weary with world-wandering and heavy with disappointed hopes? The youth returns not who went forth so joyously." And now Ralph Cranfield was at his mother's gate, in front of the small house where the old lady, with slender but sufficient means, had kept herself comfortable during her son's long absence. Admitting himself within the enclosure, he leaned against a great old tree, trifling with his own impatience, as people often do in those intervals when years are summed into a moment. He took a minute survey of the dwelling, its windows brightened with the sky gleam, its doorway with the half of a millstone for a step, and the faintly traced path weaving thence to the gate. He made friends again with his childhood's friend, the old tree against which he leaned, and, glancing his eye down its trunk, beheld something that excited a melancholy smile. It was a half-obliterated inscription, the Latin word effode, which he remembered to have carved in the bark of the tree with a whole day's toil when he had first begun to muse about his exalted destiny. It might be accounted a rather singular coincidence that the bark just above the inscription had put forth an excrescence shaped not unlike a hand, with the forefinger pointing obliquely at the word of fate. Such, at least, was its appearance in the dusky light. "Now, a credulous man," said Ralph Cranfield carelessly to himself, "might suppose that the treasure which I have sought round the world lies buried after all at the very door of my mother's dwelling. That would be a jest indeed." More he thought not about the matter, for now the door was opened, and an elderly woman appeared on the threshold, peering into the dusk to discover who it might be that had intruded on her premises and was standing in the shadow of her tree. It was Ralph Cranfield's mother. Pass we over their greeting, and leave the one to her joy and the other to his rest, if quiet rest he found. But when morning broke, he arose with a troubled brow, for his sleep and his wakefulness had alike been full of dreams. All the fervour was rekindled with which he had burned of yore to unravel the threefold mystery of his fate. The crowd of his early visions seemed to have awaited him beneath his mother's roof, and thronged riotously around to welcome his return. In the well-remembered chamber, on the pillow where his infancy had slumbered, he had passed a wilder night than ever in an Arab tent, or when he had reposed his head in the ghastly shades of a haunted forest. A shadowy maid had stolen to his bedside and laid her finger on the scintillating heart. A hand of flame had glowed amid the darkness, pointing downward to a mystery within the earth. A hoary sage had waved his prophetic wand and beckoned the dreamer onward to a chair of state. The same phantoms, though fainter in the daylight, still flitted about the cottage and mingled among the crowd of familiar faces that were drawn thither by the news of Ralph Cranfield's return to bid him welcome for his mother's sake. There they found him, a tall, dark, stately man of foreign aspect, courteous in demeanour and mild of speech, yet with an abstracted eye which seemed often to snatch a glance at the invisible. Meantime the widow Cranfield went bustling about the house full of joy that she again had somebody to love and be careful of, and for whom she might vex and tease herself with the petty troubles of daily life. It was nearly noon when she looked forth from the door and descried 3 personages of note coming along the street through the hot sunshine and the masses of elm-tree shade. At length they reached her gate and undid the latch. "See, Ralph," exclaimed she with maternal pride, "here is Squire Hawkwood and the 2 other selectmen coming on purpose to see you. Now, do tell them a good long story about what you have seen in foreign parts." The foremost of the 3 visitors, Squire Hawkwood, was a very pompous but excellent old gentleman, the head and prime mover in all the affairs of the village, and universally acknowledged to be one of the sagest men on earth. He wore, according to a fashion even then becoming antiquated, a 3-cornered hat, and carried a silver-headed cane, the use of which seemed to be rather for flourishing in the air than for assisting the progress of his legs. His 2 companions were elderly and respectable yeomen, who, retaining an ante-revolutionary reverence for rank and hereditary wealth, kept a little in the squire's rear. As they approached along the pathway, Ralph Cranfield sat in an oaken elbow-chair, half unconsciously gazing at the 3 visitors, and enveloping their homely figures in the misty romance that pervaded his mental world. Here, thought he, smiling at the conceit, here come 3 elderly personages, and the first of the 3 is a venerable sage with a staff. What if this embassy should bring me the message of my fate? While Squire Hawkwood and his colleagues entered, Ralph rose from his seat and advanced a few steps to receive them, and his stately figure and dark countenance, as he bent courteously toward the guests, had a natural dignity contrasting well with the bustling importance of the squire. The old gentleman, according to invariable custom, gave an elaborate preliminary flourish with his cane in the air, then removed his three-cornered hat in order to wipe his brow, and finally proceeded to make known his errand. "My colleagues and myself," began the squire, "are burdened with momentous duties, being jointly selectmen of this village. Our minds for the space of 3 days past have been laboriously bent on the selection of a suitable person to fill a most important office and take upon himself a charge and rule which, wisely considered, may be ranked no lower than those of kings and potentates. And whereas you, our native townsmen, are of good natural intellect and well cultivated by foreign travel, and that certain vagaries and fantasies of your youth are doubtless long ago corrected, taking all these matters, I say, into due consideration, we are of opinion that Providence hath sent you hither at this juncture for our very purpose." During this harangue, Cranfield gazed fixedly at the speaker, as if he beheld something mysterious and unearthly in his pompous little figure, and as if the squire had worn the flowing robes of an ancient sage instead of a square-skirted coat, flapped waistcoat, velvet breeches, and silk stockings. Nor was his wonder without sufficient cause, for the flourish of the squire's staff, marvellous to relate, had described precisely the signal in the air which was to ratify the message of the prophetic sage whom Cranfield had sought around the world. "And what," inquired Ralph Cranfield with a tremor in his voice, "what may this office be which is to equal me with kings and potentates?" "No less than instructor of our village school," answered Squire Hawkwood, "the office being vacant by the death of the venerable Master Whitaker after a 50 years' incumbency." "I will consider of your proposal," replied Ralph Cranfield hurriedly, "and will make known my decision within 3 days." After a few more words, the village dignitary and his companions took their leave, but to Cranfield's fancy their images were still present, and became more and more invested with the dim awfulness of figures which had first appeared to him in a dream, and afterwards had shown themselves in his waking moments, assuming homely aspects among familiar things. His mind dwelt upon the features of the squire till they grew confused with those of the visionary sage, and one appeared but the shadow of the other. The same visage, he now thought, had looked forth upon him from the pyramid of Cheops. The same form had beckoned to him along the colonnades of the Alhambra. The same figure had mistily revealed itself through the ascending steam of the great geyser. At every effort of his memory he recognized some trait of the dreamy messenger of destiny in this pompous, bustling, self-important, little great man of the village. Amid such musings Ralph Cranfield sat all day in the cottage, scarcely hearing and vaguely answering his mother's 1,000 questions about his travels and adventures. At sunset he roused himself to take a stroll, and, passing the aged elm-tree, was again caught by the semblance of a hand pointing downward at the half-obliterated inscription. As Cranfield walked down the street of the village, the level sunbeams threw his shadow far before him, and he fancied that, as his shadow walked among distant objects, so had there been a presentiment stalking in advance of him throughout his life. And when he drew near each object over which his tall shadow had preceded him, still it proved to be one of the familiar recollections of his infancy and youth. Every crook in the pathway was remembered. Even the more transitory characteristics of the scene were the same as in bygone days. A company of cows were grazing on the grassy roadside, and refreshed him with their fragrant breath. "It is sweeter," thought he, "than the perfume which was wafted to our ship from the Spice Islands." The round little figure of a child rode from a doorway and lay laughing almost beneath Cranfield's feet. The dark and stately man stooped down, and lifting the infant, restored him to his mother's arms. "The children," said he to himself, and sighed and smiled, "the children are to be my charge." And while a flow of natural feeling gushed like a wellspring in his heart, he came to a dwelling which he could nowise forbear to enter. A sweet voice, which seemed to come from a deep and tender soul, was warbling a plaintive little air within. He bent his head and passed through the lowly door. As his foot sounded upon the threshold, a young woman advanced from the dusky interior of the office, at first hastily, and then with a more uncertain step, till they met face to face. There was a singular contrast in their two figures. He, dark and picturesque, one who had battled with the world, whom all suns had shone upon and whom all winds had blown on a varied course. She, neat, comely, and quiet even in her agitation, as if all her emotions had been subdued to the peaceful tenor of her life. Yet their faces, all unlike as they were, had an expression that seemed not so alien, a glow of kindred feeling flashing upward anew from half-extinguished embers. "You are welcome home," said Faith Egerton. But Cranfield did not immediately answer, for his eye had been caught by an ornament in the shape of a heart which Faith wore as a brooch upon her bosom. The material was the ordinary white quartz, and he recollected having himself shaped it out of one of those Indian arrowheads which are so often found in the ancient haunts of the red men. It was precisely on the pattern of that worn by the visionary maid. When Cranfield departed on his shadowy search, he had bestowed this brooch, in a gold setting, as a parting gift to Faith Egerton. "So, Faith, you have kept the heart?" said he at length. "Yes," said she, blushing deeply. Then, more gaily, "And what else have you brought me from beyond the sea?" "Faith," replied Ralph Cranfield, uttering the fated words by an uncontrollable impulse, "I have brought you nothing but a heavy heart. May I rest its weight on you. "This token which I have worn so long," said Faith, laying her tremulous finger on the heart, "is the assurance that you may." "Faith, Faith!" cried Cranfield, clasping her in his arms. "You have interpreted my wild and weary dream." Yes, the wild dreamer was awake at last. To find the mysterious treasure, he was to till the earth around his mother's dwelling and reap its products. Instead of warlike command or regal or religious sway, he was to rule over the village children. And now the visionary maid had faded from his fancy, and in her place he saw the playmate of his childhood. Would all who cherish such wild wishes but look around them, they would oftenest find their sphere of duty, of prosperity, and happiness within those precincts and in that station where Providence itself has cast their lot. Happy they who read the riddle without a weary world-search or a lifetime spent in vain. End of The Threefold Destiny. End of Twice Told Tales by Nathaniel Hawthorne. Read by Bob Neufeld.